Manipulation rarely begins with someone openly telling you, "I'm going to control you." If it did, most of us would recognize it immediately. It usually begins in much smaller moments. Someone becomes disappointed when you say no, and suddenly you feel guilty. Someone questions your memory with enough confidence that you begin questioning it too. Someone withdraws affection after you disagree with them, and before long you are trying to repair a relationship you did not damage. Nothing dramatic seems to be happening. You still feel as though you are making your own decisions, but slowly, another person's reactions begin shaping what you say, what you tolerate, what you explain, and eventually what you choose. That is what makes manipulation difficult to recognize. It does not always feel like control. Sometimes it feels like guilt, sometimes obligation, sometimes love, sometimes the exhausting feeling that if you could just explain yourself more clearly, the other person would finally understand. And sometimes it hides inside one of our most human desires. We want the people around us to be okay with us. We want to be seen as reasonable, caring, loyal, and good. There is nothing wrong with wanting that. The problem begins when someone discovers that our need for their approval is stronger than our willingness to trust our own judgment. The Stoics understood this vulnerability long before psychology gave us modern language for manipulation. Epictetus kept returning to a simple distinction. Some things belong to our control, and others do not. We often hear that idea as advice for dealing with circumstances, but it becomes much more uncomfortable when applied to relationships. Another person's disappointment is not completely ours to control. Their opinion of us is not ours to control. Whether they become angry when we establish a boundary is not ours to control. Yet we can spend enormous amounts of our lives trying to control exactly these things, and that effort makes us surprisingly easy to manipulate. Becoming difficult to manipulate does not mean becoming suspicious of everyone, emotionally cold, or unwilling to compromise. Healthy relationships require influence. We listen, reconsider, apologize, change our minds, and sometimes do things we would rather not do because another person genuinely matters to us. The difference is whether we are being persuaded through truth and mutual respect or pushed through fear, guilt, confusion, and emotional pressure. And that difference becomes much easier to see once we stop focusing only on what the other person is doing and begin noticing what happens inside us when they do it. Because manipulation needs somewhere to land. The first step, then, is learning to recognize it before the reaction becomes the decision. Manipulation becomes much easier to resist once you stop expecting it to look dramatic. Most of the time, there is no obvious threat, no clear demand, and no moment where another person openly tells you that your freedom depends on doing what they want. It usually appears in smaller shifts inside an ordinary conversation. You express a preference, and they become unusually disappointed. You question something they did, and suddenly the discussion becomes about how much you hurt them by questioning it. You remember an event one way, they insist it happened differently, and their certainty begins making you distrust your own memory. You set a reasonable boundary, and instead of discussing the boundary itself, they begin questioning your character. You've changed. You only think about yourself now. I would never do that to you. What makes these moments difficult is not simply the language. It is the way the emotional cost of standing by your position suddenly rises. The original decision becomes harder to hold, not because new facts have appeared, but because saying no, disagreeing, or maintaining a limit now seems to carry a threat to your identity, your relationship, or the other person's emotional state. This is why manipulation is often misunderstood. We tend to focus on intention and ask whether the other person is consciously trying to control us. Sometimes they are. A person may know exactly which accusation makes you defensive, which kind of silence makes you chase them, which expression of disappointment makes you reconsider, and which insecurity makes you easier to pressure. But manipulation can also become habitual without being carefully planned. Someone may have learned very early that anger gets attention, guilt gets cooperation, helplessness gets other people to take over, or withdrawal makes people come closer. They may repeat these behaviors almost automatically because the behaviors have worked before. From your perspective, however, the immediate task is not to prove what is happening inside their mind. You usually cannot know that with certainty. The more useful task is to notice what the interaction repeatedly does to your ability to think freely. A good place to begin is by asking yourself what happens to your judgment once the other person reacts. Suppose you tell someone that you cannot help them this weekend. Before they respond, the decision feels reasonable. Then they sigh and say, "It's fine, I'm used to handling everything alone anyway." In a few seconds, the practical question has changed. You are no longer thinking mainly about whether you are available. You are thinking about whether you are abandoning them. You begin remembering everything they have done for you, everything you have failed to do, and all the evidence that might prove you are not selfish. You may start explaining why you are busy, offering alternatives you do not actually want to offer, or reconsidering plans you had good reasons to keep. Nothing physically forced you to change your decision. The pressure worked by changing what the decision seemed to mean about you. That shift is important to recognize because once you begin defending your identity, you may stop examining the original issue. You said no, and now you are proving that you are caring. You asked for accountability, and now you are proving that you are not cruel. You expressed discomfort, and now you are defending whether you are too sensitive. The subject moves away from whatever required the other person to tolerate frustration, answer a question, or respect a boundary, and your psychology becomes the new subject. Sometimes that shift happens because the other person is deliberately trying to regain control of the conversation. Sometimes it happens because they are emotionally reactive and do not know how to tolerate discomfort without making it personal. Either way, recognizing the shift gives you a chance to return to what was actually happening before the emotional pressure appeared. One practical way to do that is to separate the request from the reaction. The request itself may be reasonable or unreasonable. Someone wants your time, money, attention, forgiveness, agreement, or emotional support. Evaluate that first, then their reaction arrives. They become angry, disappointed, cold, affectionate, wounded, or urgent. Evaluate that separately. Do not allow the intensity of the reaction to rewrite the merits of the original request automatically. If you had good reasons to say no 30 seconds ago, ask whether any new information has actually appeared. Perhaps it has. Maybe you misunderstood how urgent the situation was, overlooked an important responsibility, or did not realize how strongly your decision would affect someone you care about. In that case, reconsidering is not weakness. But if no new information has appeared and only the emotional pressure has increased, then the feeling of urgency may be coming from the interaction rather than from the facts. This is where time becomes useful. Manipulation often becomes more effective when it can compress the space between emotion and decision. I need an answer right now. If you really cared, you wouldn't have to think about it. Why is this even difficult for you? These statements do more than ask for a response. They suggest that hesitation itself is evidence against you. So one of the simplest ways to protect judgment is to reclaim enough time to think. You can say that you need to consider it, that you will answer later, or that you are not making an important decision while the conversation is emotionally charged. A person with a legitimate request may dislike the delay, but someone who respects your autonomy can usually tolerate the fact that you need enough mental space to decide. If asking for time produces even more pressure, that reaction is worth noticing. The Stoics would have recognized this problem as one of impressions. Epictetus repeatedly emphasized that something can appear powerfully in the mind without therefore being true or worthy of immediate assent. In a manipulative interaction, the first impression may be, "They're upset, so I must have done something wrong." Or, "If I don't fix this now, I could lose them." Or maybe I really am selfish. The thought arrives with emotion attached to it, and that emotional force makes the thought feel less like an interpretation and more like a fact. Recognition means creating enough distance to say, maybe that is true, but I have not established it yet. That small pause protects judgment from being swallowed by the intensity of the moment. At the same time, becoming difficult to manipulate requires enough humility to avoid labeling every uncomfortable reaction as manipulation. Sometimes another person is simply upset because you genuinely hurt them. Sometimes their criticism is accurate. Sometimes your boundary is badly communicated, your decision is selfish, or your memory is incomplete. If you use the language of manipulation to avoid accountability, you become less clear, not more. The question is whether the interaction leaves room for your independent judgment. A healthy person can tell you that they are disappointed and still allow you to think. They can challenge your behavior without making disagreement itself evidence that you do not care. They can ask you to reconsider without making love, respect, or connection conditional on immediate compliance. Manipulation tends to make independent judgment feel dangerous. Thinking becomes betrayal. Saying no becomes selfishness. Asking questions becomes disrespect. Disagreement becomes proof that something is wrong with you. This is why patterns matter more than isolated moments. Anyone can become emotional once. Anyone can say something unfair in frustration. But if the same structure appears repeatedly, you say no, they attack your character. You ask for clarity, they increase pressure. You remain calm, they escalate. Then the pattern is telling you something about how the relationship handles your autonomy. The goal is not to become suspicious of everyone. It is to become more observant of what changes inside you when pressure appears. Do you become desperate to explain? Do you feel compelled to fix their mood before thinking about the actual issue? Do you start doubting a decision solely because they became upset? Do you agree because the argument feels exhausting rather than because your mind genuinely changed? These reactions are not proof that the other person is manipulative, but they reveal where your judgment becomes easiest to influence. Over time, the deepest change is learning the difference between changing your mind because you received better information and changing your mind because you could no longer tolerate another person's reaction. From the outside, both may look like compromise. Internally, they are very different. One preserves agency. The other teaches the relationship that emotional pressure works. And once a certain kind of pressure reliably changes your answer, human behavior tends to repeat what produces results. Guilt becomes useful, anger becomes useful, withdrawal becomes useful, not necessarily because someone is consciously calculating every move, but because patterns survive when they keep working. That is why recognizing manipulation before you react is only the first layer. The next question is why certain reactions from other people have so much influence over you in the first place. For many of us, the answer is uncomfortable but simple. We need the people around us to remain happy with us more than we realize. One of the easiest ways to become controllable is to make another person's emotional comfort a condition for your own peace. If they are pleased with you, you relax. If they understand your decision, you trust it more. If they respond warmly to a boundary, the boundary feels reasonable. But the moment they become disappointed, irritated, distant, or cold, your confidence begins to change even when none of the facts have changed. You replay what you said, wonder whether you were too harsh, search for a better explanation, and sometimes reverse a decision simply because the tension feels harder to tolerate than the compromise. From the outside, this can look like kindness or flexibility, and sometimes it is. Relationships require adjustment, and caring about how our choices affect other people is part of being emotionally mature. The problem begins when someone else's happiness stops being something you value and becomes something you feel responsible for maintaining. At that point, their displeasure can influence you without anyone needing to make a direct demand. This becomes easier to see when you notice how differently a decision can feel before and after another person reacts to it. Imagine that someone asks for a favor you genuinely cannot manage. You think about it, decide that you do not have the time or energy, and say no. For a few seconds, the decision feels completely reasonable. Then they become quiet and say, "I guess I know who I can rely on now." Suddenly, the practical question of whether you can help has been replaced by a much more personal question about whether you are loyal. You begin remembering all the times you have helped them, perhaps explaining your schedule in unnecessary detail or offering alternatives that create problems for you. The important thing is that no new information has appeared. Your available time has not increased. Your responsibilities have not disappeared. What changed was the emotional meaning attached to your refusal, and because being seen as dependable matters to you, the accusation begins exerting pressure that the original request could not. This is why manipulation often works through qualities we consider good, rather than through obvious weaknesses. A caring person can be pressured through guilt because they do not want to cause pain. A loyal person can be pressured through accusations of abandonment because loyalty matters to their identity. A conscientious person may become easy to influence through blame, while someone who values harmony may surrender repeatedly simply because unresolved tension feels unbearable. None of these qualities needs to be removed. Becoming harder to manipulate does not require becoming less generous, less compassionate, or less interested in maintaining good relationships. The vulnerability appears when you need to prove those qualities every time someone questions them. If being called selfish immediately makes you abandon a reasonable boundary, then the accusation has become a shortcut around your judgment. If being called uncaring makes you say yes to things you genuinely cannot sustain, your desire to be caring is no longer entirely guiding your behavior. Your fear of being seen otherwise is guiding it. This pattern often develops gradually inside relationships where you have become known for playing a particular role. Perhaps you are the person everyone calls when something goes wrong, the one who rarely refuses requests, the friend who always listens, the family member who solves practical problems, or the partner who eventually gives in because you dislike prolonged conflict. People become accustomed not only to who you are, but to what your behavior makes available to them. Then something changes. You become exhausted, your priorities shift, or you simply recognize that the arrangement is no longer sustainable. The first few times you behave differently, other people may genuinely feel confused or disappointed. From their perspective, something they could once depend on has changed. That reaction does not automatically mean they are manipulating you, but it creates an important moment of truth because you now discover whether the relationship can adapt to a version of you that has limits. This is where many people retreat too quickly. Someone says, "You've changed," and instead of considering whether the change is healthy, we hear the sentence as evidence that something has gone wrong. But change is not inherently betrayal. Sometimes you have changed because you finally noticed that being endlessly available was making you resentful. Sometimes you stopped agreeing because you began thinking more carefully about what you actually believe. Sometimes the person who says you have changed is simply describing the fact that a behavior they benefited from is no longer automatic. Their disappointment may be sincere, and you can care about it without assuming that returning to the old version of yourself is the correct response. A useful distinction is between caring about someone's emotional response and treating that response as a verdict. If someone you love tells you that a decision hurt them, listen. Ask whether there is something you failed to consider. Perhaps you were insensitive, broke an agreement, or underestimated how much the decision affected them. Their reaction may contain information that should change your thinking, but after you have considered it honestly, there may still be situations where the decision remains the same. You can understand why someone is disappointed and still believe that saying no was necessary. You can acknowledge their frustration without treating frustration as proof that your boundary was unfair. This is one of the more difficult forms of emotional maturity because it requires empathy without surrender. The Stoic distinction between what belongs to us and what does not becomes especially useful here. You have some influence over how other people feel about you, and pretending otherwise would be unrealistic. Your behavior affects relationships. Your words can hurt, reassure, disappoint, or comfort. But influence is not control. You can communicate carefully and still be misunderstood. You can act generously and still be called selfish when you finally say no. You can make a thoughtful decision and still disappoint someone you love. If your inner stability requires preventing those outcomes, you have made your peace dependent on something you can influence but never completely govern. This is why telling yourself that you should stop caring what anyone thinks is not particularly useful. Most of us do care, especially when the person matters to us, and there is nothing inherently weak about that. A better internal standard is that their reaction deserves consideration, but does not automatically decide the issue. This leaves room for both relationship and autonomy. If someone is hurt, you can listen without immediately surrendering. If they are angry, you can examine your behavior without assuming that anger proves wrongdoing. If they are disappointed, you can acknowledge that disappointment without rushing to remove it. The purpose is not to become unaffected by other people, but to restore a small space between their emotional response and your behavioral response. That space becomes especially important when displeasure appears through distance rather than argument. Some people do not openly challenge your decision. They become colder, less affectionate, or less responsive. The change may be subtle enough that you begin doing the work yourself. You ask whether something is wrong, explain your decision again, reassure them that you care, and perhaps eventually offer the thing you originally refused. Sometimes the person genuinely needs space, and there is nothing manipulative about that. But if warmth repeatedly disappears when you establish a limit and returns when you surrender it, the pattern deserves attention. You may have learned that maintaining closeness requires keeping the other person pleased, and once that association becomes strong enough, they do not even need to ask you to change. Your fear of disconnection begins doing the work for them. This can be difficult to change because relational tension does not feel like a neutral intellectual problem. Human beings are deeply sensitive to belonging, and disapproval from people who matter can activate fear that seems much larger than the immediate disagreement. This is one reason someone can know intellectually that a boundary is reasonable and still feel almost compelled to remove it when another person becomes upset. The nervous system wants the familiar connection restored. Understanding this helps because you stop expecting yourself to feel completely comfortable while changing the pattern. The goal is not to wait until someone's disappointment no longer affects you. The goal is to become capable of acting thoughtfully while that discomfort is present. You can practice this in ordinary situations where the stakes are relatively low. Decline an invitation when you genuinely need rest without constructing an elaborate excuse. Express a mild disagreement and notice the impulse to soften it simply because someone looks uncomfortable. Stop apologizing for neutral preferences that do not harm anyone. If a friend is disappointed that you cannot meet, allow them to be disappointed without spending the rest of the evening trying to convince yourself that you are still a good friend. These experiences gradually teach something that abstract reassurance cannot. Another person can be unhappy with you for a while, and the world does not collapse. The relationship may remain intact, the emotion may pass, and you may discover that much of the emergency existed inside your anticipation of what their displeasure meant. Sometimes, however, a relationship does change when you stop organizing yourself around another person's happiness. That possibility should not be minimized. Someone who was accustomed to unrestricted access may genuinely prefer the old arrangement. A person who relied on you always being the one to compromise may find the new version of the relationship less comfortable. This is where the change becomes informative. You begin seeing whether the connection can survive your autonomy, whether disagreement is allowed without punishment, and whether the other person can remain close to you when your needs occasionally inconvenience them. Those questions tell you far more about the quality of a relationship than how peaceful everything feels when you always cooperate. The deeper shift is learning that being a caring person does not require being permanently responsible for the emotional weather around you. You still examine yourself. You still apologize when you have done something wrong. You still compromise when compromise is fair, and sometimes choose another person's needs over your own because they matter to you. But you stop using their happiness as the final measurement of whether your decision was legitimate. Some good decisions disappoint people. Some necessary boundaries create tension. Some honest conversations make relationships temporarily uncomfortable. If you cannot tolerate those outcomes, then keeping everyone pleased will eventually become more important than living according to your own considered judgment. And once you begin accepting that someone can be unhappy with you without that unhappiness becoming an emergency, manipulation loses one of its easiest routes into your decisions. But there are moments when disappointment becomes much more intense, when guilt, fear, anger, or urgency fills the conversation and you are pushed to choose before you have enough distance to think. In those moments, even someone who has become more comfortable with disapproval can still surrender simply to make the pressure stop. That is why the next step is learning to protect important decisions from the emotional conditions in which they are being demanded. A decision can be technically yours and still not feel fully chosen. Nobody may be forcing you in any obvious way, and you may still be the one saying yes, agreeing, promising, or changing your mind. But the emotional conditions surrounding the decision can become so intense that the real objective shifts. Instead of asking whether the choice is wise, fair, sustainable, or consistent with what you actually want, you begin asking a much narrower question without realizing it. How do I make this tension stop? Someone is angry and you want the anger to end. Someone is crying and you cannot tolerate feeling responsible for their pain. Someone threatens to withdraw, leave, expose something, or change the relationship unless you decide immediately. Sometimes there is no explicit threat at all. The pressure comes through urgency, disappointment, guilt, or confusion, and agreeing begins to feel easier than continuing to resist. The moment you give in, the tension drops, and that relief can be mistaken for certainty, even though what you actually achieved was escape from the emotional atmosphere around the decision. This matters because emotional pressure does not merely influence what we think, it changes what the mind is trying to solve. Under calmer conditions, you may naturally consider consequences, alternatives, timing, and whether the request itself is reasonable. Under pressure, attention narrows. The mind becomes more interested in restoring safety than evaluating the decision on its own terms. Imagine someone asks to borrow money from you after failing to repay previous loans. Your first reaction is hesitation because the practical history gives you good reasons to be careful. Then they become offended and say, "After everything I've done for you, you really don't trust me." Nothing about the financial reality has changed, but the meaning of saying no suddenly feels different. Now it seems connected to loyalty, gratitude, and the future of the relationship. You may agree because you no longer want to occupy the role of the suspicious, ungrateful person. Later, once the emotional pressure is gone, the original reasons return, and you wonder why they disappeared so quickly in the moment. This is one of the places where time becomes a form of psychological protection. Not endless delay, not avoidance, but enough distance to allow judgment to recover. If a decision matters and the emotional intensity is high, it is often reasonable to say that you need time to think, that you are not making the decision during an argument, or that you will return with an answer when you are calmer. These responses can make another person more frustrated, especially if they are accustomed to getting immediate reassurance or agreement, but their frustration does not automatically make the pause wrong. In fact, the reaction to your request for time can reveal something useful about the interaction. A person with a legitimate need may dislike waiting, but they can usually tolerate the fact that you need enough mental space to think. Someone who benefits from your emotional confusion may become much more uncomfortable when that confusion is interrupted. You do not need to diagnose their motives to notice that your ability to reflect is being treated as a problem. The Stoic connection here is straightforward. Epictetus repeatedly emphasized that the first impression should not automatically receive our assent. Under emotional pressure, impressions become unusually persuasive because they arrive with physical and relational intensity attached to them. You may think, if they are this upset, I must have done something wrong, or if I don't answer right now, I could lose them, or if I feel this guilty, perhaps I owe them what they want. The feeling makes the interpretation seem factual, but the two are not identical. Feeling guilty does not establish guilt. Feeling afraid does not establish danger. Feeling urgency does not prove that the situation is genuinely urgent. The point is not to distrust emotion completely, because emotion can contain important information. The point is to stop allowing emotional intensity to substitute for evidence. One useful question is to imagine the same decision without the pressure around it. If the anger disappeared, if nobody were crying, if nobody were waiting for an immediate answer, if the threat of withdrawal were removed, what would you think about the actual request? Would you still believe the commitment was reasonable? Would the boundary still make sense? Would you still want to say yes? This does not mean pretending another person's feelings are irrelevant. Their feelings may be an important part of the situation, especially in close relationships. But there is a difference between including someone's emotional experience in your judgment and allowing the strongest emotion in the room to become the judgment itself. You can care deeply about how your decision affects someone while still insisting that the decision be made under conditions where you can think clearly. This becomes especially important when pressure is repeated often enough that you begin anticipating it. At first, another person may become angry when you say no. Later, they may not need to become angry because your memory of their anger is already shaping the choice. You think, this is going to become a huge argument, so you agree before the argument starts. You think, they'll stop speaking to me, so you abandon the boundary before they withdraw. You think, they'll call me selfish, so you start explaining yourself before they even object. At that point, the pressure has become internalized. The other person may not be doing anything in the present moment, but your nervous system is continuing the pattern on their behalf. This is why reclaiming time can initially feel more uncomfortable than simply giving in. You are not only resisting the immediate request, you are disrupting a learned sequence in which agreement has repeatedly been used to prevent emotional consequences. There is an important caution here because "I need time" can also become a way of avoiding responsibility. Some decisions genuinely require an answer. Some conversations cannot be postponed indefinitely. If you ask for time, use it, examine the facts, consider the other person's perspective, look honestly at your own motives, and then return with a decision. The purpose of the pause is not to escape commitment. It is to separate commitment from emotional compulsion. And after reflection, you may still decide that the other person was right. You may realize that your first resistance came from fear, stubbornness, or incomplete information. Changing your mind after calm reflection is not surrender. The important difference is that the decision now belongs to your judgment rather than to the need to make pressure disappear. Over time, this creates a different relationship with intensity. Anger no longer guarantees an immediate answer. Guilt no longer guarantees agreement. Urgency has to be real rather than merely emotional. You become more willing to tolerate the unfinished moment in which another person remains upset and nothing has been resolved yet. That can be difficult, especially if you have spent years restoring peace as quickly as possible. but it also builds a deeper kind of self-trust. You begin to know that even when the room becomes uncomfortable, you do not have to abandon your own judgment in order to make it calm again. You can remain thoughtful while someone else remains disappointed, and you can make important decisions only after the emotional pressure has lost enough force for you to see what you are actually choosing. That matters because one emotion in particular can continue exerting pressure even after the other person becomes quiet. It can follow you after the conversation, sound like your own conscience, and make compliance feel morally necessary rather than emotionally convenient. That emotion is guilt, and learning to recognize it without automatically obeying it is the next step. Guilt is one of the easiest emotions to confuse with truth because it carries a moral weight that anger or fear do not. If you feel angry, you usually recognize that you are experiencing anger. If you feel afraid, you know fear is present. But guilt often arrives with an implied conclusion. If I feel this bad, perhaps I must have done something bad. That assumption can make guilt unusually powerful in relationships, because once another person learns that your conscience is easy to activate, they do not always need to argue with you directly. They only need to create enough emotional discomfort that you begin questioning your own character. A disappointed expression, a familiar phrase, a reminder of everything they have done for you, or the suggestion that a decent person would behave differently can be enough to make you reconsider a decision that seemed completely reasonable moments earlier. The difficulty is not that guilt is always false. Genuine guilt is useful. If you break a promise, betray trust, behave cruelly, or neglect a responsibility you knowingly accepted, guilt can point towards something that needs repair. The problem begins when the feeling itself becomes the evidence, and we stop asking whether we actually violated one of our values. This is why a more precise question matters. Instead of asking, "Why do I feel guilty?" ask, "What exactly did I do wrong?" That change may seem small, but it moves the mind from emotion toward evidence. Imagine a relative asks you for help at a time when you are already exhausted and overcommitted. You say no, and they respond, "I guess family just doesn't mean what it used to." The sentence lands immediately because it does not simply express disappointment. It places your identity inside the disagreement. Now the question no longer feels like whether you have the capacity to help. It becomes whether you are loyal, caring, or selfish. If you are not careful, you can spend the next hour trying to escape that identity rather than examining the request itself. But if you ask what you actually did wrong, the situation becomes clearer. Maybe you had made a commitment and are backing out carelessly. In that case, the guilt may be pointing toward responsibility, or perhaps you had never agreed, you genuinely do not have the capacity, and the only thing that changed is that the other person disliked your answer. In that case, the guilt may be reflecting their disappointment rather than your wrongdoing. This distinction becomes especially important because many of us have learned to treat other people's negative emotions as moral evidence against ourselves. Someone is upset, so perhaps we failed them. Someone is angry, so perhaps our boundary was unfair. Someone cries, so perhaps we were cruel. But another person's emotion tells us that something matters to them. It does not automatically tell us who is right. A child can be deeply disappointed by a reasonable limit. A friend can feel hurt when you decline something they hoped you would do. A partner can disagree strongly with a decision that is still thoughtful and defensible. Their feelings deserve attention, but they do not always create an obligation. Emotional maturity requires being able to take someone's pain seriously without automatically converting that pain into a command to reverse your position. Guilt becomes even more complicated when it is expressed indirectly. Not everyone says, "You should feel guilty." More often, the pressure comes through lines like, "Don't worry about me, I'll manage like I always do," or "I just thought I could count on you." These phrases can create a very specific emotional picture in which the other person is abandoned and you are the one doing the abandoning. Because the picture is emotionally vivid, you may rush to correct it before examining whether it is accurate. This is where returning to the facts matters. What was actually requested? What had you agreed to? What are you realistically responsible for? What would you think if someone you cared about described the same situation to you? That last question can be revealing because we often apply harsher standards to ourselves than we would ever impose on another person. We can recognize immediately that a friend is allowed to be tired, unavailable, or unwilling. Yet when we occupy the same position, another person's disappointment makes ordinary limits feel morally suspect. The reason guilt works so well is that it often attaches itself to qualities we genuinely value. A caring person is vulnerable to being called selfish. A loyal person is vulnerable to being accused of abandonment. A conscientious person can be pulled by blame, and a forgiving person can be pulled by repeated promises that this time will be different. The quality itself is not the weakness. The weakness appears when you become so attached to proving that you are caring, loyal, generous, or dependable that another person can threaten that identity whenever they want something from you. At that point, the virtue is no longer entirely voluntary. You begin helping not because you freely chose to help, but because saying no would create an identity crisis. Kindness loses some of its meaning when it can be extracted through guilt on demand. The Stoic response is not to become colder or less compassionate. It is to make compassion deliberate again. The Stoics cared deeply about character, but character was supposed to come from principle rather than emotional coercion. So when guilt appears, ask which principle is actually involved. Is this fairness, responsibility, gratitude, compassion, or is the hidden principle simply that nobody should ever be disappointed with you? Those are very different standards. You may decide that gratitude genuinely matters in a situation and that you do want to help because someone supported you in the past. But gratitude is not the same as permanent obligation. A past kindness can reasonably influence your willingness to help, but it should not become an unlimited claim over your future decisions. A gift that becomes an invoice every time you say no was never entirely free of expectation. This is also why it helps to stop treating guilt as something that must be eliminated immediately. You can feel guilty and still wait. You can let the discomfort remain long enough to examine whether it belongs to reality. Sometimes, after reflection, the guilt stays because you genuinely acted badly. Then you repair what you can. Other times, the guilt weakens once you realize that you did not betray a value. You simply disappointed someone. That is a very different emotional situation. The goal is not to become numb to guilt, but to become less obedient to it. The feeling can raise a question without dictating the answer. This becomes more difficult when the old pattern has been repeated for years. If you have always been the one who says yes, helps, reassures, pays, fixes, or smooths things over, then changing that pattern may initially produce more guilt rather than less. The guilt is not necessarily evidence that the new boundary is wrong. It may simply be evidence that the old behavior was partly organized around avoiding this exact feeling. You are not only helping people, you are also protecting yourself from the possibility of being seen as disappointing, selfish, or difficult. Once you stop purchasing relief through compliance, the feeling becomes more visible because you are finally allowing it to exist without immediately neutralizing it. That is where autonomy becomes uncomfortable but real. You remain accountable for genuine harm. You apologize when you owe an apology. You correct yourself when the facts show that you were wrong. But after honest examination, you allow another person to remain disappointed if disappointment is what belongs to the situation. You stop treating every negative emotion around you as evidence that you have failed someone morally. And once guilt loses some of its authority, another pattern becomes easier to see. Many people depend on the fact that you will keep explaining your decision until they find a reason they can challenge. Your desire to be understood becomes another opening. That is why the next step is learning when explanation stops serving clarity and starts weakening your own decision. Over-explaining often begins with a reasonable intention. You want the other person to understand that your decision is not personal, careless, or hostile, so you give them context. You explain why you cannot come, why you need more time, why you disagree, why you are uncomfortable with something, or why a boundary has become necessary. In a healthy conversation, explanation can create understanding because both people are interested in what the other person actually means. But there is a point where explanation quietly changes its function. You are no longer providing information. You are trying to obtain permission. You keep adding reasons because the other person has not yet accepted the first ones, and without noticing it, you begin treating their acceptance as something your decision requires. This is where over-explaining can make you easier to manipulate. Every additional reason becomes another detail that can be questioned, minimized, compared, or negotiated, and the conversation gradually moves away from whether you are allowed to make the decision at all and toward whether you can construct an explanation the other person considers sufficient. Imagine someone asks you to attend something on a weekend when you genuinely need time to yourself. You could simply say that you will not be able to make it, but perhaps that feels too abrupt, so you explain that you have had a difficult week and need to rest. They respond that everyone is tired and that you can rest another day. Now you mention that you also have work to finish. They tell you the work can wait. You explain that you have already made plans for the morning, and they begin suggesting ways you could rearrange those plans. The more information you provide, the more the conversation starts resembling a negotiation in which your reasons must survive cross-examination before your no can become valid. At some point, you may find yourself inventing stronger reasons because the truth that you simply do not want to go does not feel defensible enough. What began as an attempt to be considerate has turned into a search for an excuse the other person cannot defeat. The important thing to notice is that not every decision requires a reason that another person agrees with. Sometimes your explanation is relevant because your choice directly affects them, or because you have responsibilities toward them. If you cancel an important commitment, change a shared plan, or make a decision that imposes a significant cost on someone else, they may reasonably deserve more than a vague statement. Refusing to explain anything in those situations can become avoidance disguised as boundaries. But many ordinary personal decisions do not require a legal defense. You can decline an invitation because you do not want to attend. You can decide not to lend money even if you could technically afford it. You can refuse to discuss a private subject without proving why it is private. You can choose not to continue a conversation that has become disrespectful. The other person may want more explanation, and you may choose to offer some, but their dissatisfaction with your reason does not automatically invalidate your decision. This is particularly difficult when you have learned that being understood is the safest way to avoid conflict. If you grew accustomed to explaining yourself carefully so that nobody became angry, disappointed, or suspicious, explanation can become almost automatic. You anticipate objections before they appear. You give 5 reasons when one would have been enough. You soften every preference with context and every boundary with reassurance. Sometimes you begin defending yourself before anyone has even challenged you. The behavior can look thoughtful, but underneath it there may be a quiet assumption that your choices are only safe if you can make everyone see them as reasonable. That assumption gives other people more influence than they need, because now they do not have to prove that your decision is wrong. They only have to refuse to understand it long enough for you to start doubting yourself. A manipulative dynamic can exploit this very easily. You say you cannot do something, and instead of accepting the answer, the person asks why. You explain, They challenge the explanation, so you clarify. They find an inconsistency, so you provide more context. Eventually, the discussion has moved several layers away from the original boundary, and you are defending details that were never the real issue. Perhaps you said you were too busy, and they point out that you spent 2 hours watching a movie yesterday. Now you feel compelled to explain why resting for 2 hours does not mean you have the capacity to take on their request. The conversation becomes absurdly detailed because you accepted the premise that your time belongs to you only after every alternative use of it has been justified. This is where brevity can become a form of clarity, not coldness, not hostility, simply enough information for the situation. I can't do that. That doesn't work for me. I'm not comfortable discussing that. I've decided not to go. You can add context when it serves the relationship, but you do not need to keep producing new reasons because the first reason failed to produce approval. If someone asks a sincere question, answer it if you want to. If they are confused, clarify. But once you notice that every explanation is simply generating another objection, it may be time to stop explaining and return to the decision itself. You can acknowledge that they disagree without continuing the debate. I understand that you see it differently, but my decision is the same. The value of that response is not that it wins the argument. It ends the assumption that the argument must be won before your decision can stand. There is a Stoic discipline underneath this because over-explaining is often an attempt to control something that cannot be completely controlled, another person's interpretation of us. We imagine that if we can find exactly the right words, nobody will think we are selfish, unreasonable, difficult, ungrateful, or uncaring. Sometimes better communication does change how someone sees us, and we should not dismiss that. But there are also moments when another person has reasons of their own for misunderstanding us. Perhaps accepting your explanation would mean accepting a boundary they dislike. Perhaps seeing your decision as reasonable would require them to tolerate frustration. Perhaps they simply have a different value system. At some point, continuing to explain becomes an attempt to manage their judgment rather than communicate your own. The behavioral change is subtle because it is not about explaining less in every situation. It is about noticing the moment when explanation stops being communication and becomes self-defense. You can often feel that moment physically. Your sentences become faster and longer. You begin searching for stronger evidence. You repeat yourself in slightly different language. You monitor the other person's face to see whether they finally accept what you are saying. If they remain unconvinced, anxiety rises and you add another argument. When you notice that pattern, it can help to stop and ask yourself whether there is genuinely more information that needs to be communicated or whether you are now trying to force agreement. If the important information has already been given, silence may be more useful than another paragraph. This does not mean you should become rigid. Sometimes someone challenges your explanation because your reasoning genuinely does not make sense, and listening carefully may reveal that. Self-respect is not the belief that every decision you make is beyond question. You can hear criticism, reconsider, and change your mind without surrendering your autonomy. The difference is that reconsideration comes from finding the criticism persuasive, not from becoming exhausted by the pressure to defend yourself. If someone points out something you overlooked, take it seriously. If they merely repeat that your answer is unacceptable because it does not give them what they want, you do not have to keep manufacturing reasons. Over time, shorter explanations can reveal the actual structure of a relationship. People who respect your autonomy may still ask questions, disagree, or express disappointment, but eventually they recognize that your decisions do not require endless justification. People who are accustomed to negotiating every boundary may react differently. They may accuse you of being cold, secretive, difficult, or changed because the old access point has disappeared. Previously, disagreement could pull you into an hour of explanation. and somewhere inside that hour there was a good chance you would become tired enough, guilty enough, or uncertain enough to give in. When that process stops working, the change can feel dramatic to someone who benefited from it. There is also something quietly stabilizing about discovering that you can survive being misunderstood. You can know why you made a decision without transferring that certainty into another person's mind. You can communicate honestly and still accept that they may walk away with a version of you that you do not recognize. That does not mean their opinion never matters. It means you stop treating complete control over their opinion as the price of making your own choices. You become more careful about when explanation is an act of respect and when it is an attempt to purchase approval. And once you stop providing endless explanations, something interesting often happens. The interaction becomes simpler. Your no remains a no long enough for you to observe what the other person actually does with it. Do they respect it, negotiate reasonably, ask for clarification, or immediately begin punishing you for having a boundary? That reaction can tell you more about the relationship than all the explanations you might have given. Which is why the next step is not merely learning how to say no. It is learning to pay close attention to what happens after you say it. You can learn a surprising amount about a relationship from what happens when another person does not get what they want from you. As long as your preferences align, your availability remains high, and your answers are mostly yes, it can be difficult to tell whether someone genuinely respects your autonomy or simply enjoys the version of the relationship in which your autonomy rarely inconveniences them. Agreement hides many things. A person can appear generous, patient, easygoing, and respectful, while there is nothing significant for them to tolerate. The more revealing moment comes when you decline something they expected, disagree with something they believe, refuse access they previously enjoyed, or simply make a choice that benefits you rather than them. Their disappointment itself is not the problem. Healthy people become disappointed, frustrated, and sometimes angry when they hear no. What matters is what they do with that emotion, because there is a meaningful difference between experiencing frustration and turning frustration into a strategy for changing your answer. Imagine someone asks you for something you have often provided before. Maybe it is your time, money, attention, labor, emotional support, or simply your availability whenever they need you. This time you cannot do it, or perhaps you have realized that continuing to do it is no longer healthy for you, so you say no. At first they ask why, and you explain briefly. Then they ask again in a slightly different way. When the answer remains the same, the emotional tone changes. They become colder, remind you of what they have done for you, question whether you care about them, or begin listing all the reasons your decision is unreasonable. Perhaps they stop speaking to you for a while, or they tell other people a version of the story in which your boundary becomes evidence that you have changed. None of these reactions alone proves that someone is deliberately manipulating you, but together they can reveal an important pattern. Your no is not being treated as information about your limit. It is being treated as an obstacle that must be removed. This is why boundaries are often more informative than explanations. You can spend months trying to understand whether someone respects you, but a clear limit can reveal the answer much faster. Respect is easy to perform when it costs nothing. The meaningful question is whether the other person can continue treating you with basic dignity while not getting what they want. Can they disagree without insulting you? Can they tell you they are disappointed without making you responsible for repairing the disappointment? Can they ask whether you might reconsider without behaving as though your refusal is illegitimate? Can they remain connected to you even when you are temporarily inconvenient? A healthy relationship does not require everyone to enjoy every boundary. It requires enough mutual recognition that frustration does not erase the other person's right to have one. The difficulty is that many of us evaluate these moments too quickly. The instant someone reacts badly, we become focused on calming them rather than observing what is happening. We explain more, soften the answer, offer alternatives we do not actually want to offer, or reassure them that nothing has changed between us. In doing so, we lose valuable information. We never discover whether the person could have regulated their own disappointment because we intervene immediately and regulate it for them. We also unintentionally teach the relationship that resistance produces additional attention. A simple request becomes an extended conversation. A no produces 10 minutes of reassurance. Anger produces negotiation. Withdrawal produces pursuit. Over time, the emotional reaction can become more effective than the original request because it reliably generates more access to you. This does not mean you should deliberately test people by withholding things or creating artificial boundaries to see how they react. Relationships are not psychological experiments, and manufactured tests often create the very distrust they claim to measure. The useful observations come from ordinary life. There will naturally be moments when you cannot help, do not agree, need privacy, want to leave, require rest, or simply prefer something different. Those moments provide enough information if you stop immediately trying to erase every negative reaction. You can remain calm, respectful, and open to conversation while allowing the other person to show you how they handle frustration. One of the clearest patterns to watch for is escalation. You say no politely, and the person asks again. You repeat yourself, and now they become irritated. You remain steady, and irritation becomes accusation. When accusation does not work, perhaps they withdraw affection, invoke past sacrifices, create urgency, or threaten some consequence. The specific behavior varies, but the underlying pattern is that the emotional cost of maintaining your answer keeps increasing. This matters because a boundary that is respected only after you provide the answer someone wants is not really being respected. If peace returns only when you comply, you may begin learning that compliance is the price of relational stability. That learning can happen very quietly. Eventually, you may stop saying no before the other person even asks twice, because you already know the sequence that follows. You imagine the argument, the coldness, the guilt, the endless conversation, and decide that giving in is easier. From the outside, the relationship may look peaceful because there are fewer conflicts. Internally, however, the peace is being maintained by anticipation. You have learned which parts of yourself are too expensive to express. This is one reason the absence of conflict does not necessarily indicate a healthy relationship. Sometimes there is little conflict because both people respect one another. Sometimes there is little conflict because one person has learned to surrender early. There is a useful Stoic distinction here between what belongs to your responsibility and what belongs to the other person. Your responsibility includes the manner in which you communicate the boundary. You can ask whether you are being unnecessarily harsh, whether your expectations are fair, whether you have broken an agreement, and whether the other person deserves more context. Their responsibility begins with what they do after receiving that information. You cannot control whether they like the boundary, and trying to guarantee that they will like it can turn the boundary into another attempt to manage their emotional state. You can speak respectfully without guaranteeing a respectful interpretation. You can say no without controlling whether someone calls the answer selfish. At the same time, it is important not to misuse this idea. Someone pushing back against your no is not automatically manipulative. There are situations where negotiation is appropriate, especially when decisions affect shared responsibilities. If you tell a coworker that you will not complete work you agreed to do, or tell your partner that you have made a major financial decision affecting both of you and refuse to discuss it, calling their resistance disrespect for your boundary would be misleading. A boundary describes what you will or will not participate in. It does not give you immunity from obligations or consequences. The point is not to turn every preference into an unquestionable command. It is to notice whether another person can engage with your autonomy without trying to destabilize you emotionally. A practical way to do this is to reduce what you do after a reasonable no. Say what needs to be said, answer legitimate questions, and then allow a little space. If the person is disappointed, let disappointment exist. If they need time, give them time. If they disagree, you do not need to convert disagreement into agreement before the interaction can end. This can feel unnatural if you are accustomed to repairing every emotional disturbance immediately, but it gives both people an opportunity to take responsibility for their own internal state. Sometimes the other person calms down and returns with a more reasonable conversation. Sometimes you realize that their first reaction came from surprise or fear rather than any attempt to control you. And sometimes the pressure continues, which gives you information you would have missed if you had immediately surrendered. Over repeated interactions, patterns become more important than isolated moments. Anyone can react badly once. People become tired, frightened, insecure, or overwhelmed. A single defensive response does not define a person. What matters is whether they can reflect afterward, recognize that they crossed a line, and behave differently the next time. If someone becomes upset by your boundary, but later says, in effect, "I didn't handle that well," you are seeing capacity for self-correction. If the same sequence repeats every time you say no, and somehow every conflict ends with you apologizing for having a limit that deserves closer attention, manipulation is often easier to recognize as a recurring structure than as an individual sentence. There is another reason to watch these moments carefully. Your no reveals not only the other person's relationship with your autonomy, but your own. Notice how quickly you begin doubting yourself when they resist. Notice whether their anger makes the boundary suddenly seem unreasonable, even though none of the facts changed. Notice whether you become desperate to explain, apologize, or offer compensation simply because another person is uncomfortable. These reactions show you where your own work remains. Becoming difficult to manipulate is not mainly about becoming better at detecting bad people. It is about becoming familiar enough with your own vulnerabilities that another person cannot easily use them to replace your judgment. Eventually, saying no becomes less about winning a confrontation and more about allowing reality to become visible. You discover who can tolerate your independence, which relationships depended on excessive accommodation, and which fears inside you have been keeping old patterns alive. You also discover that a person can be unhappy with you without the relationship necessarily ending, and that even when a relationship does change, preserving it at the cost of permanent self-betrayal was never genuine security. Once you begin watching reactions instead of immediately fixing them, another form of manipulation becomes easier to recognize. Sometimes people do not attack your boundary directly. Instead, they tell you what your own feelings, intentions, or memories supposedly mean, and if they do it confidently enough, you may begin trusting their interpretation of your inner world more than your own. There is a subtle difference between someone helping you understand yourself and someone repeatedly telling you who you are until you begin doubting your own experience. In close relationships, other people sometimes see things about us that we cannot see clearly from the inside. A friend may notice that we are more hurt than we admit. A partner may recognize a pattern we keep repeating, and someone who knows us well may correctly sense that anger is covering fear, or that indifference is covering disappointment. We should not become so defensive that every outside observation feels like an invasion. But there is another kind of interaction in which interpretation stops being an invitation to reflect and becomes a way of overruling your own account of yourself. You say that you need some space, and someone tells you that you are actually trying to punish them. You say you are not comfortable with something, and they insist that you are only afraid. You explain that a comment hurt you, and they tell you that you are not hurt. You are simply looking for something to complain about. The pattern is not merely that they disagree with your interpretation. It is that their interpretation is treated as more authoritative than your own. And if this happens often enough, you may begin looking to them for permission to know what you feel. This becomes particularly confusing because none of us has perfect access to our own motives. Human beings rationalize, avoid uncomfortable truths, misremember events, and sometimes describe our behavior in ways that protect the image we have of ourselves. Someone else can genuinely help us see that. If 3 people we trust independently tell us that we become defensive whenever a particular subject comes up, it may be worth considering whether they are noticing something real. The problem is not that another person interprets your behavior differently. The problem begins when disagreement itself is no longer allowed. In a healthy interaction, someone can say, "I wonder if part of you is angry," and you can think about it, agree, disagree, or remain uncertain. In a controlling interaction, the same observation becomes a conclusion you are expected to accept. "You're angry. I know you better than you know yourself." If you resist, your resistance becomes additional proof. Now there is almost no possible answer that allows you to retain authority over your own experience. This can create a strange kind of psychological dependency because you gradually stop beginning with what you notice inside yourself and start beginning with what the other person will say it means. Imagine that every time you raise a concern with someone, they respond by interpreting your motives. You tell them that you dislike the way they spoke to you, and instead of discussing what was said, they tell you that you are insecure. You mention that they repeatedly cancel plans, and they tell you that you are controlling. You ask for more consistency, and they say your real problem is fear of abandonment. Any one of those interpretations could contain some truth, but notice what happens to the original subject. Their behavior disappears from the center of the conversation, and your psychology takes its place. Soon you are defending whether you are insecure, controlling, or afraid, rather than discussing the specific behavior you originally wanted to address. If this happens repeatedly, you may eventually stop raising concerns because every concern becomes evidence against you. The practical response is not to prove that your interpretation is always correct. It is to refuse the false choice between accepting someone else's explanation completely and rejecting everything they say. You can hold their interpretation as information without surrendering your own perspective. You might think, maybe there is some insecurity involved, and I still do not want to be spoken to that way. Both things can be true. You may have abandonment fears and still reasonably want consistency. You may be sensitive about a subject and still have been treated disrespectfully. You may have misunderstood part of an interaction without therefore imagining the entire thing. This ability to hold more than one truth at once makes manipulation much harder because you no longer have to defend a perfect version of yourself in order to protect a legitimate boundary. The same principle applies when someone begins defining your intentions for you. They say, "You only did that to make me jealous," or "You're saying this because you want attention," or "You don't actually care about me." It is tempting to enter an endless argument about what is inside your mind, especially when the accusation feels unfair. You start listing evidence of your intentions, reminding them of previous conversations, and trying to make them accept your account. But intentions are difficult to prove from the outside, which makes these arguments almost impossible to finish. A more grounded response is to state what you know and leave room for what you do not. You can say, "That wasn't my intention, although I understand why it may have looked that way," without spending the next hour trying to force them to believe you. You remain open to the possibility that your behavior had an impact you did not intend, while refusing to let someone else simply rewrite the intention itself. There is a Stoic dimension to this because the Stoics were deeply concerned with examining our own judgments. That examination, however, was an internal responsibility. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly questioned his reactions and motives, but the purpose was to become more honest with himself, not to hand someone else permanent authority over his mind. There is a difference between humility and psychological surrender. Humility says that I may be wrong about myself and should remain open to evidence. Surrender says that another person's confidence is enough to make me distrust my own experience. A stable mind needs both openness and an internal center from which openness is possible. Without openness, we become rigid. Without an internal center, we become suggestible. One way to protect that center is to become more precise about your own experience. Instead of making broad declarations about the other person, stay close to what you actually know. When you said that, I felt embarrassed. I remember the conversation differently. I don't know exactly why this is affecting me yet, but I know I'm uncomfortable. These statements are harder to pull into abstract debates because they do not claim omniscience. You are not saying that your interpretation of the entire relationship is unquestionably correct. You are describing the experience available to you. If new information appears, you can update your understanding without pretending that the original experience never existed. This matters particularly when memory becomes part of the conflict. Two people can remember the same conversation differently without either person deliberately lying. Memory is reconstructive, not a perfect recording, and confidence is not a reliable measure of accuracy. If someone remembers an event differently, their version deserves consideration, but certainty alone should not make you abandon your own recollection. You can say, I accept that you remember it differently. This is how I remember it, and resist the pressure to produce absolute certainty where absolute certainty may not be possible. The danger begins when one person consistently insists that only their memory can be trusted, and your recollection is always evidence of confusion, irrationality, or bad intent. Over time, that can weaken your confidence in ordinary perception. It helps to pay attention to what happens after you acknowledge uncertainty. In a healthy conversation, saying, maybe I'm remembering part of this incorrectly, usually creates room for both people to examine what happened. In an unhealthy dynamic, admitting even a small uncertainty may be used to invalidate everything else you said. You concede that perhaps one detail was wrong, and suddenly the entire concern is treated as imaginary. This can teach you to become defensive and insist that you remember everything perfectly, which is also unhealthy. A stronger position is to tolerate uncertainty without allowing uncertainty to erase what you do know. You can be wrong about a detail and still right that a pattern bothers you. You can misunderstand someone's intention and still dislike the impact of their behavior. Over time, the goal is to develop a relationship with yourself in which other people can influence your self-understanding without owning it. You listen when someone you trust tells you something difficult. You consider whether defensiveness is preventing you from seeing yourself clearly. You apologize when reflection shows that your interpretation was unfair. But you also notice when psychological language is being used to move attention away from another person's behavior and onto supposed defects inside you. You become less impressed by certainty and more interested in evidence, patterns, and whether the conversation allows both people to have a perspective. That internal stability becomes especially important when another person is disappointed with you, because one of the easiest ways to regain their approval is to assume responsibility for feelings that were never entirely yours to manage. Once someone can convince you that their disappointment is proof of your failure, your boundaries become difficult to maintain even when you know exactly what you feel. The next step then is learning how to care about another person's disappointment without automatically treating it as your responsibility. There is a difficult emotional distinction that becomes essential if you want to remain caring without becoming controllable. You can contribute to someone's disappointment without automatically becoming responsible for removing it. Those two ideas are easy to collapse into one another because relationships naturally involve emotional consequences. You cancel plans and someone feels disappointed. You decline a request and they feel hurt. You decide to spend less time with someone and they feel rejected. You establish a boundary and they become frustrated by the access they no longer have. Their feelings may be completely real, understandable, and directly connected to something you chose, which is why it can seem obvious that you should do something to make those feelings disappear. But emotional responsibility is more complicated than simple cause and effect. If a friend asks you to lend them money and you decline, your answer may cause disappointment, but that does not mean you owe them the loan. If someone wants more access to your time than you can sustainably give, reducing that access may hurt them without making the reduction wrong. The question is not simply whether your decision created an unpleasant feeling. The question is whether you violated a genuine responsibility, behaved unfairly, or caused harm that you reasonably should repair. This distinction matters because otherwise anyone who can become sufficiently disappointed can acquire influence over your choices. Imagine you have a friend who expects you to answer whenever they are distressed. For a long time you do. You answer late at night, interrupt your work, postpone your own plans, and become the person they automatically reach for whenever something goes wrong. Eventually, you realize that the arrangement is exhausting you, so you become less available. Your friend may genuinely feel abandoned by the change. From their perspective, something important has been lost, and it would be dismissive to pretend that their reaction is meaningless. You can acknowledge that the change is difficult and perhaps help establish a healthier way of staying connected. But if their sadness automatically requires you to restore unlimited availability, then their emotional response becomes a veto over your limit. You are no longer deciding what you can sustainably give. You are deciding how much discomfort you can tolerate seeing in them. This is where many thoughtful people become vulnerable, because empathy can create a strong urge to repair. You can see the disappointment in someone's face and immediately begin searching for a way to reduce it. Sometimes that instinct is exactly what a relationship needs. If you forgot an important commitment or acted carelessly, their disappointment may be telling you something about your behavior, but sometimes there is nothing to repair. Two legitimate needs simply conflict. You need rest and someone wants your company. You need financial stability and someone wants your help. You want to end a relationship and the other person wants it to continue. There may be no outcome in which everyone feels good. If your definition of a morally acceptable decision requires the absence of disappointment, you will eventually become unable to make certain necessary choices. This is especially clear when expectations have formed around a version of you that was giving more than you could sustain. Perhaps you were always available, rarely disagreed, accepted disrespect to keep the peace, or took responsibility for problems that were not really yours. When you change, the people around you do not experience your internal history. They experience the loss of what they were receiving. To them, your new boundary can feel like a withdrawal. That does not mean their feeling is dishonest. They may sincerely believe that you have become distant, selfish, or less caring. But sincerity does not automatically make the expectation reasonable. Sometimes another person is disappointed because you failed them. Sometimes they are disappointed because you stopped abandoning yourself for them, and those two situations require very different responses. A useful way to separate them is to ask what responsibility existed before the emotion appeared. If nobody were upset, would you still believe you had an obligation here? Did you make a promise? Did you accept a role that reasonably carries this responsibility? Are you changing an agreement that affects another person without giving them appropriate consideration? Did you behave carelessly or unfairly? If the answer is yes, then their disappointment may be pointing towards something you need to address. But if the responsibility seems to appear only after they become upset, be careful. Their emotion may deserve compassion without creating a new obligation. This question prevents the intensity of the reaction from rewriting the structure of the situation. The Stoic distinction between what belongs to us and what does not becomes useful here. Although it needs to be applied carefully, another person's emotions are not under your control, but your conduct toward them is. You can choose honesty, fairness, patience, and consideration. You can avoid unnecessary cruelty. You can explain a difficult decision when the relationship deserves an explanation. What you cannot guarantee is that behaving well will produce a pleasant emotional response. Sometimes you will do the most reasonable thing available and someone will still be hurt. The desire to control that outcome can lead you into exactly the kind of over-responsibility that makes manipulation possible, because now anyone who knows that you cannot tolerate their distress has a way to influence you without ever openly demanding control. This does not mean adopting the convenient phrase, "Your feelings are not my responsibility," and using it to avoid accountability. That idea becomes destructive when treated as an absolute. We affect one another, and mature relationships require caring about that impact. If you repeatedly behave in ways that hurt someone and then dismiss every reaction as their problem, you are not practicing emotional independence. You are refusing relational responsibility. The more useful distinction is between caring about someone's feelings and assuming ownership of them. Caring means listening, considering whether you contributed unfairly, changing behavior when change is warranted, and sometimes making sacrifices because the relationship matters. Ownership means believing that their emotional equilibrium must be restored by you, even when restoring it requires violating a reasonable boundary or taking responsibility for something that does not belong to you. You can hear the difference in the way a difficult conversation unfolds. Suppose someone says, "I'm hurt that you didn't come." You might respond by acknowledging that you understand why they were disappointed and explaining that you still needed to stay home. Both realities can remain present. You do not need to argue them out of their disappointment, and you do not need to abandon your decision to prove that you care. If you did something wrong, apologize for the wrong thing specifically. If you did not, resist the temptation to apologize simply for the existence of their feeling. Constantly saying, "I'm sorry," whenever someone is disappointed, can slowly train both of you to treat disappointment as evidence that you committed an offense. There is also a deeper reason this skill matters. When you assume responsibility for everyone's disappointment, resentment eventually tends to appear. You keep saying yes because no feels cruel, but internally you become exhausted. You help when you do not want to help, stay when you want to leave, listen when you have no capacity left, and agree because disagreement seems too expensive. On the surface you may appear generous, but underneath there is often a growing sense that people take too much from you. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they have never been given an honest opportunity to know your limits because you kept hiding those limits until resentment became the only place they could exist. Learning to tolerate someone's disappointment allows generosity to become more honest because your yes begins meaning something again. The behavioral shift is therefore not dramatic. When someone is disappointed by a reasonable decision, resist the impulse to fix the emotion immediately. Listen first. Determine whether there is information you missed or harm you need to repair. If there is, respond to it. If there is not, allow the emotional consequence to exist without rushing to remove it. The person may need time to adjust. They may remain unhappy with your choice. You can continue treating them respectfully while allowing that disagreement to remain unresolved. This is difficult if you associate relational tension with danger, but repeated experience teaches you that another person can be unhappy with you and you can still remain connected, thoughtful, and steady. And if the relationship cannot tolerate that, if every disappointment becomes punishment, every boundary produces withdrawal, and every refusal requires you to earn warmth back, then the problem may not be the disappointment itself. The problem may be what the other person has learned to do with it. One of the clearest examples is the silent treatment, because withdrawal can make you work harder than open anger ever could, while allowing the person withdrawing to say almost nothing at all. That is why the next step is learning to stop rewarding silence when silence is being used as pressure. Silence between two people is not automatically unhealthy. Sometimes it is exactly what a difficult moment needs. A person may know that they are too angry to speak carefully, so they step away until they can think. Someone may need an evening alone after an argument because continuing the conversation would only produce words they do not mean. There are also people who simply process emotion internally and need more time before they can explain what they are feeling. None of this is necessarily manipulation. The important difference is not whether someone becomes quiet, but what the silence is doing inside the relationship. Healthy space creates enough distance for regulation and eventually makes communication more possible. The silent treatment does something different. It creates uncertainty and leaves you inside that uncertainty until you become willing to do whatever restores connection. There may be no explicit demand, yet the message can still be clear. Warmth, attention, or normal communication will return when you behave differently. This form of pressure can be particularly effective because human beings do not respond neutrally to unexplained withdrawal from someone important to us. When a person who was warm yesterday becomes cold today, the mind naturally searches for a cause. You replay the last conversation, inspect your words, reread messages, and try to identify the moment something changed. If you already tend to assume responsibility for other people's emotions, the uncertainty becomes even harder to tolerate because you do not merely wonder what happened. You begin wondering what you need to do to repair it. Perhaps you send another message after the first goes unanswered, then another explaining what you meant, then an apology that you are not even sure you owe. By the time the person begins speaking normally again, you may have done most of the emotional work without ever having a direct conversation about the original issue. What makes the pattern powerful is that the relief of reconnection can overshadow everything that happened before it. You are simply glad the tension is over, so you do not examine what you learned during the silence. When this person withdraws, you chase. Once that sequence repeats, both people can become conditioned by it even if neither consciously planned the pattern. One person experiences discomfort, withdraws, and eventually receives pursuit, reassurance, apology, or compliance. The other experiences withdrawal as danger and learns that pursuing restores emotional safety. Over time, the actual disagreement matters less than the sequence around it. Perhaps you originally said no to something reasonable, challenged behavior that bothered you, or expressed an opinion they disliked. Their withdrawal then becomes more psychologically significant than the issue itself. You stop asking whether your original position made sense and start asking how to make the relationship feel normal again. If normality returns only after you soften the boundary or take responsibility, your nervous system begins learning that maintaining your position is emotionally expensive. This is why the most useful response to the silent treatment is rarely to become silent in return as punishment. Matching manipulation with manipulation does not create autonomy. It simply changes who is applying pressure. The healthier response is to make communication available without chasing it. If someone clearly needs space, you can respect that space. If you are unsure what is happening, you can address it once in a calm and direct way. You notice that something seems different. You are willing to talk when they are ready, and if they need time, you will give it to them. Then the difficult part begins, because you have to allow the space to remain space. You do not send repeated messages trying to extract reassurance. You do not offer progressively larger apologies simply to receive a response. You do not reverse a reasonable decision because the emotional atmosphere has become uncomfortable. You have opened the door to communication without making yourself responsible for dragging the other person through it. There is an important distinction here because refusing to chase does not mean refusing to repair. If you actually did something harmful, the fact that someone has withdrawn does not remove your responsibility. You can still acknowledge what you did, apologize clearly, and offer to discuss it. But even a genuine mistake does not require you to spend days proving that you are sufficiently sorry while another person controls when you are allowed back into emotional safety. Healthy repair eventually requires participation from both sides. One person can initiate it, but one person cannot complete it alone. If you apologize sincerely and the other person needs time, they are allowed that time. What becomes unhealthy is when withdrawal remains intentionally undefined and your uncertainty becomes part of the punishment. The difference can often be seen in whether the person communicates the need for space. There is a significant emotional difference between someone saying, "I'm too upset to talk productively right now. I need some time, but we can talk tomorrow," and someone abruptly becoming cold while refusing to tell you whether anything is wrong. Both involve temporary distance, but the first provides enough clarity that you do not have to spend the next 12 hours decoding the relationship. It does not guarantee that the conversation will be comfortable, but it preserves basic psychological safety. The second leaves you guessing, and if guessing reliably makes you more compliant, the silence acquires leverage. For someone accustomed to chasing, changing this pattern can feel almost physically uncomfortable. You may understand intellectually that another person is allowed to take space, yet your mind continues producing reasons to contact them. Perhaps they misunderstood your last message. Perhaps one more explanation would help. Perhaps you should apologize just in case. The urge is often less about communication than about regulating your own anxiety. You want evidence that the relationship still exists in the form you recognize. This is where the Stoic practice of separating what you can govern from what you cannot becomes practical rather than philosophical. You can govern whether your communication is honest, whether you have acknowledged your part, whether you remain available for a respectful conversation, and whether you continue behaving according to your values. You cannot force another person to speak, forgive, understand, or reconnect on your preferred schedule. Repeated pursuit does not change that limitation. It merely makes your peace dependent on obtaining the response. Allowing the silence to remain also gives you information that chasing tends to hide. If the other person genuinely needed time to regulate, space gives them what they needed, and they may eventually return ready to communicate more clearly. If they were expecting pursuit, your refusal to perform the familiar role may produce frustration or escalation. They might accuse you of not caring because you did not chase, even though they were the one who withdrew. That reaction can reveal an expectation that is worth examining. Perhaps you were supposed to prove your care by becoming anxious enough to pursue them. A relationship in which love must repeatedly be demonstrated through panic is difficult to sustain because emotional security depends on creating insecurity first. This does not mean every instance of withdrawal should be analyzed as a manipulation tactic. People shut down for many reasons, including overwhelm, conflict avoidance, fear, shame, or simply not knowing how to communicate under stress. Intent matters when understanding the person, but pattern matters when deciding how you should respond. If unexplained withdrawal repeatedly appears after you establish boundaries, disagree, or refuse requests, and normal warmth repeatedly returns after you surrender your position, you do not need certainty about the other person's internal motive to recognize what the pattern is doing to you. You can respond to the structure of the interaction without turning the person into a villain. The deeper behavioral change is learning that you do not have to purchase connection by abandoning yourself. You can care that someone is upset, remain open to repair, and still continue with your day while they decide whether they want to communicate. At first, this may feel like indifference because you are accustomed to measuring care by how much emotional labor you perform. But care does not require compulsive pursuit. Sometimes the more respectful position is to allow another adult to own their silence and return when they are prepared to speak. Your task is not to punish them for withdrawing or rescue them from the consequences of refusing communication. It is to remain available without becoming controllable. Over time, this changes the emotional economy of the relationship. Silence stops producing automatic pursuit. Withdrawal stops guaranteeing that you will abandon a boundary. If someone needs genuine space, they can take it without being chased. If they want something from you, direct communication becomes more useful than creating uncertainty. And you begin discovering that the anxiety produced by another person's distance can rise, remain for a while, and eventually fall without requiring you to do anything impulsive to make it disappear. That experience is important because it teaches your nervous system something your intellect alone cannot teach it. Temporary disconnection is uncomfortable, but discomfort is not the same as danger. Once withdrawal loses its ability to control you, another source of clarity becomes increasingly important. Manipulation often survives because individual conversations are confusing, apologies sound convincing, and promises temporarily restore hope. What becomes much harder to argue with is repetition. When the same behavior keeps returning despite different explanations and different promises, the pattern itself begins telling you what isolated words cannot. That is why the next step is learning to trust patterns more than promises. Promises are emotionally powerful because they speak directly to the future, and the future is where hope lives. When someone hurts you and then says they understand, when they apologize with apparent sincerity and describe exactly how they intend to change, it can create immediate relief because the problem suddenly seems temporary. The painful behavior belongs to yesterday, while the person standing in front of you is describing tomorrow. This is especially persuasive when you care about them and want the relationship to work. You are not necessarily being naive when you believe them. People do recognize their mistakes, habits can change, and relationships would become impossible if we treated every failure as permanent evidence of character. But there is a point where repeatedly believing what someone says they will become requires ignoring what they continue to be in practice. Manipulation becomes easier when words are allowed to erase patterns, because every new promise resets your judgment before behavior has had time to provide evidence. Imagine a person who repeatedly crosses a boundary you have discussed clearly. Each time it happens, there is a conversation. They explain that they were stressed, misunderstood what you meant, reacted because they were afraid of losing you, or did not realize how much the behavior affected you. Perhaps the explanation is partly true. They apologize, seem genuinely remorseful, and tell you that it will not happen again. For several days or weeks, things improve, and you feel reassured. Then the same behavior returns. Another conversation follows. Another explanation makes emotional sense, and another promise creates a new beginning. If you evaluate each incident separately, you may continue concluding that this particular occurrence was understandable. But if you step back and look at the sequence, a different reality appears. Whatever the explanations are, the behavior is recurring. This is why patterns are so important. A pattern does not tell you everything about another person's motives, but it tells you something about what your life with them actually contains. Someone may sincerely intend to change and still be unable or unwilling to do the work necessary to change. They may mean every apology when they give it. They may genuinely hate the consequences of their behavior, but sincerity at the moment of regret is not the same thing as sustained behavioral change. If the result in your life remains the same, the distinction between deliberate manipulation and repeated failure may matter for how much compassion you feel toward them, but it does not remove the need to respond to reality. We often resist this because explanations are easier to relate to than patterns. A pattern is impersonal. It says that this has happened 6 times. An explanation gives us a story. They had a difficult childhood. They are under pressure at work. They are afraid of abandonment. They have never had a healthy relationship. They did not mean it the way it sounded. Those things may all be true, and understanding them can make us more compassionate. But understanding why someone behaves a certain way does not automatically make the behavior safe, fair, or sustainable. There is a difference between explanation and exemption. Psychology can help us understand the origin of a behavior without requiring us to live indefinitely with its consequences. This is particularly relevant in manipulative relationships because the apology itself can become part of the pattern. The cycle is not simply harmful behavior followed by regret. It may become pressure, conflict, apology, reconciliation, temporary improvement, and then repetition. The reconciliation feels so meaningful that it is easy to treat it as evidence that the relationship has fundamentally changed. Yet if reconciliation repeatedly returns you to the beginning of the same cycle, then reconciliation is no longer proof of change. It is one stage inside the recurring structure. Recognizing this does not require assuming that every apology is calculated. Sometimes people genuinely believe that insight will be enough. They feel terrible, understand the damage in the moment, and assume that because they now understand it, they will behave differently next time. But habits, emotional reactions, and relational patterns rarely change through insight alone. Change eventually has to become visible in behavior. This is where it helps to become more specific about what evidence of change would actually look like. If someone repeatedly pressures you after you say no, change is not simply them agreeing that they should respect boundaries. Change is what happens the next time you say no. If someone uses silence to punish you after disagreements, change is not an eloquent apology for doing it last week. Change is their ability to communicate their need for space during the next conflict. If someone repeatedly insults you when angry, change is not how ashamed they feel afterward. It is what they do with anger when it arrives again. This moves your attention away from the emotional intensity of the repair and toward the behavioral reality that follows it. The Stoics placed enormous value on conduct because philosophy, to them, was not primarily something a person declared. It had to become visible in the way life was lived. There is something useful in applying the same standard to relationships. Words matter because communication matters, but words are predictions until behavior confirms them. A promise describes an intention. A pattern describes what has actually been happening. When those two consistently disagree, it is reasonable to give greater weight to what is repeatedly observable. That does not mean keeping a secret record of every mistake someone makes or turning relationships into statistical analysis. Human behavior is messy. People regress. Someone can make real progress and still fail occasionally. If a person used to react badly every week and now does it once in 6 months, focusing only on the fact that the behavior happened again would ignore meaningful change. Patterns include direction as well as repetition. Is the behavior becoming less frequent, less intense, and more quickly repaired? Does the person take responsibility without needing to be forced? Are they changing the conditions that repeatedly produced the problem? Do they catch themselves earlier? These are behavioral signs that a promise is gradually becoming real. The same fairness should be applied to ourselves. We also make promises we do not keep. We say we will communicate better, become more patient, stop reacting defensively, or respect someone's needs, and then find ourselves repeating familiar behavior. If we expect others to judge us only by our intentions while we judge them entirely by their failures, we are not practicing clarity. The point is not to become unforgiving. It is to stop confusing intention with evidence, whether the intention belongs to someone else or to us. A practical way to do this is to delay emotional conclusions after an apology. You can accept the apology without immediately deciding that the problem is solved. You can appreciate what someone says while allowing time to show whether their understanding changes anything. There is no need to respond cynically with, "I'll believe it when I see it." You can simply observe. This removes some of the pressure from both people. The person does not have to convince you through increasingly dramatic promises, and you do not have to decide in one conversation whether they have transformed. The future will provide information. This approach also protects you from a common form of confusion, mistaking emotional intensity for depth of change. Someone may cry, speak beautifully, reveal painful memories, or express profound regret. Those moments can be completely sincere, but emotional intensity tells you how strongly they feel in that moment, not necessarily what they will do when the same trigger returns 3 weeks later. Sustainable change is often much less dramatic. It looks like pausing before reacting, respecting a boundary without an argument, following through on an agreement, seeking help when needed, or doing something differently when nobody is applauding the effort. Over time, trusting patterns more than promises changes the questions you ask. Instead of repeatedly asking whether someone means what they say, you begin asking what the relationship consistently asks you to live with. Do you repeatedly have to defend ordinary boundaries? Do conflicts repeatedly end with you doubting your own memory? Does affection repeatedly disappear when you disagree? Are apologies followed by different behavior, or merely by a period of calm before the same problem returns? These questions are less dramatic than trying to determine whether someone is a good or bad person, but they are often more useful because you do not need a moral verdict on another human being before deciding what you can continue participating in. There is also a certain peace in allowing behavior to answer questions that words have kept complicated. You do not need to solve every contradiction immediately. Someone can tell you that they respect you, and you can allow time to show what respect looks like when you say no. They can tell you that they have changed, and you can remain open while watching whether the old pattern actually changes. You can hope without making hope responsible for your judgment. Compassion remains possible, but it is no longer purchased by ignoring evidence. And sometimes the pattern reveals something more specific. The information you share when you are vulnerable repeatedly returns later as ammunition. A fear you confessed during a quiet conversation becomes something they mention during an argument. An insecurity you trusted them with becomes a pressure point when they want compliance. When that happens, the issue is no longer only whether you can recognize manipulation after it begins. It becomes a question of what access you continue giving someone who has shown you how they use it. That is why the next step is learning to protect vulnerability without becoming emotionally closed. Vulnerability is often described as though openness is automatically a sign of emotional health, but openness is only healthy when it is paired with judgment. There is a difference between being capable of vulnerability and making yourself equally vulnerable with everyone. The things you reveal when you trust someone, the fears you rarely admit, the parts of your past that still affect you, the insecurities you are trying to understand, the relationships that wounded you, the places where rejection still reaches you. Give another person a more accurate map of your inner world. In a healthy relationship, that map allows them to move through your life with greater care. They understand why certain things matter to you. They know where unnecessary cruelty would land, and they become better able to support you without treating your sensitivity as weakness. But the same knowledge has another possible use. A person who wants leverage does not need to discover where you are vulnerable if you have already explained it to them, and one of the clearest signs that someone should receive less access to your inner world is that information given in trust repeatedly reappears when they are angry, threatened, or trying to control the direction of a conversation. This can happen so gradually that the first few incidents are easy to dismiss. Perhaps you once admitted that you are afraid of becoming like a difficult parent, and months later during an argument someone says, "You're exactly like your father." Maybe you told them that a previous relationship left you sensitive to abandonment, and whenever you establish a boundary they threaten to leave or accuse you of pushing everyone away. You confided that you sometimes struggle with confidence, and when you disagree with them they suggest that your judgment cannot be trusted because you are insecure. The cruelty is not only in the words themselves, it is in the conversion of intimacy into ammunition. Something was originally offered so that you could be known more accurately, and now the same information is being used to make resistance emotionally expensive. Once this happens repeatedly, continuing to disclose at the same depth is not necessarily openness anymore. It may simply be giving more precise tools to someone who has already shown you what they do with them. The difficulty is that withholding vulnerability from an unsafe person can initially feel dishonest, especially if the relationship is close. We may have absorbed the idea that intimacy means telling someone everything, and that protecting parts of ourselves means we are emotionally unavailable. But privacy and dishonesty are not the same thing. You can be truthful without providing unrestricted access to every internal struggle. In ordinary life, we already understand this intuitively. You do not tell a casual acquaintance everything you would tell your closest friend, not because you are pretending to be someone else, but because trust develops through evidence. Emotional access can work the same way. Someone learns that they can be trusted with small things before they are trusted with larger things. They show that they can hear something sensitive without gossiping about it, mocking it, using it during conflict, or making it about themselves. Over time, greater openness becomes a response to demonstrated safety rather than an automatic requirement of closeness. This is also where people sometimes misunderstand forgiveness. You may forgive someone for using a vulnerability against you and still decide that they no longer receive the same kind of information. Forgiveness concerns what you continue carrying toward the person. Trust concerns what access their behavior has earned. The two do not have to move at the same speed. Someone can sincerely apologize, and you may believe the apology while still allowing future behavior to determine whether deeper trust returns. If a person breaks something valuable in your home, forgiving them does not require immediately handing them another fragile object. Emotional trust deserves at least the same realism. The Stoics were not advocates of emotional numbness, despite the modern stereotype. Their concern was more often about placing judgment where it could remain governed by reason and character, rather than by whatever happened externally. Applied to vulnerability, that does not mean hiding every weakness so nobody can affect you. That would make manipulation more difficult in one sense, while making genuine intimacy nearly impossible. The stronger position is selective openness. You can acknowledge that human beings need connection and that meaningful relationships require being known, while also recognizing that access to your inner life carries consequences. The person who knows what you fear has more capacity to comfort you, but they also have more capacity to frighten you. The person who knows where you feel inadequate can reassure you there, but they can also strike there. Trust is partly the judgment that they will not use the second possibility simply because they become angry. One useful thing to watch is what someone does with your vulnerability during conflict. Almost anyone can be compassionate while everything between you is peaceful. The more revealing moment is when they are frustrated with you. Do they stay with the subject of the disagreement, or do they reach for the most painful thing they know about you? If you say no, do they discuss the no, or remind you that you have always been afraid of being selfish? If you question their behavior, do they respond to the question, or use something from your past to explain why your perception cannot be trusted? Conflict often reveals whether intimate knowledge is being held with care or stored as leverage. When you notice that pattern, the behavioral response does not need to be dramatic. You do not have to announce that the person has permanently lost access to your inner world, or explain every reason you are becoming more private. You can simply change what you share. Keep conversations closer to what is necessary. Process sensitive material with people who have demonstrated that they can hold it responsibly or privately until you understand it better yourself. If the relationship matters and there is enough safety for a direct conversation, you can name what happened. Something you shared in confidence was used against you, and that makes openness more difficult. Then observe what follows. A person capable of repair may understand why trust has changed and recognize that rebuilding it will require behavior rather than demands for immediate forgiveness. A person focused primarily on access may become angry that you are withholding information, which tells you something further about what that access meant to them. It is equally important not to turn this principle into permanent emotional armor. After being hurt, the temptation is to conclude that nobody should know where you are vulnerable because nobody can weaponize what they do not know. That strategy works by eliminating not only manipulation, but much of intimacy as well. If nobody knows what matters deeply to you, nobody can use it against you, but nobody can fully meet you there either. The aim is not invulnerability, it is discernment. You want to become better at distinguishing people who are curious about your inner world because they care from people who gather personal information and later use it to gain advantage. There is also an internal side to this. Vulnerabilities become especially useful as leverage when we are ashamed of them. If someone knows that being called needy terrifies you because you desperately want to see yourself as independent, the accusation can control you even when it is inaccurate. You may tolerate neglect simply to prove that you are not needy. If being called selfish is unbearable, you may give beyond your limits to disprove it. Protecting information helps, but understanding your own pressure points matters just as much. The more honestly you can say to yourself, yes, I have fears around abandonment, or yes, approval matters to me more than I sometimes want to admit, the less explosive it becomes when someone points toward those realities. Self-knowledge does not remove vulnerability, but it makes vulnerability harder to turn into a secret weapon because the information is no longer something you are desperately trying to deny. This is another reason manipulation becomes harder, as your relationship with yourself becomes more honest. A manipulator often needs a gap between what you fear may be true about yourself and what you are willing to examine. They can threaten to expose the thing inside that gap. When you have already looked at it, you can respond with more proportion. Perhaps there is truth in what they say, and you can work on it. Perhaps there is not. Either way, you do not have to surrender the immediate disagreement merely because someone touched an insecurity. Eventually, emotional privacy becomes less about hiding and more about stewardship. Not everyone needs access to everything simply because they ask, become close to you quickly, or insist that openness proves trust. Trust is not proven by how much you reveal. It is built through what happens after revelation. When someone consistently treats your inner life with care, deeper vulnerability can grow naturally. When they repeatedly weaponize what you share, reducing their access is not an act of revenge, it is an adjustment to evidence. And once you stop handing someone your most sensitive material to use in conflict, they may rely more heavily on another strategy, keeping you trapped in arguments that can never actually be resolved because the standard for resolution changes every time you meet it. You answer one accusation and another appears. You provide the evidence they requested and suddenly different evidence is required. You solve the original issue and discover that the issue was never really the point. That is why the next step is learning to recognize when someone keeps moving the goalposts and refusing to spend your energy chasing a conclusion that is designed never to arrive. Some arguments are difficult because two people genuinely see the same situation differently, and those disagreements can require patience, evidence, clarification, and sometimes the humility to accept that neither person will completely persuade the other. But there is another kind of argument that feels different once you learn to recognize it. You answer the question you were asked, yet the conversation does not move closer to resolution. You explain the misunderstanding, and another accusation appears. You provide the evidence someone demanded, and suddenly that evidence is no longer relevant. You apologize for the specific thing they said was hurting them, only to discover that the real problem is now your tone, the timing of the apology, the fact that they had to ask for it, or something you did months ago that had not been part of the discussion until this moment. You keep moving toward what appears to be the point of resolution, but the point keeps moving away from you. Eventually, you are no longer trying to understand what happened. You are trying to satisfy a standard that changes whenever you get close enough to meet it. This can be extremely disorienting because most reasonable people enter disagreements with an assumption that both sides are trying, at least eventually, to reach some form of clarity. Even when emotions are high, we expect that if a factual question is answered, that particular question can be set down. If someone says, "You never told me," and you show them the message where you did, you expect the disagreement to become narrower. Perhaps they forgot, perhaps the message was unclear, or perhaps there is another legitimate issue underneath it, but the original claim has at least been addressed. In a goalpost-moving argument, however, resolving one claim simply produces another. Now they say that the message was too vague. You explain what you meant, and they say the real issue is that you should have called. You point out that they previously asked you not to call during work, and now the problem becomes your attitude while explaining it. At some point, the content of the argument matters less than the fact that you are never allowed to arrive at a stable place where your answer is considered sufficient. Not every shifting argument is manipulative. Human conversations are messy, and sometimes a disagreement uncovers deeper issues as it develops. A couple may begin arguing about being late and gradually realize that the real problem is a long-standing feeling of being taken for granted. A colleague may complain about one missed deadline and then recognize that the frustration actually comes from a broader pattern. Discovering a deeper issue is not the same as moving the goalposts. The difference is whether the conversation becomes clearer as new information appears, or whether the criteria for being heard, forgiven, or considered reasonable continually change in a way that keeps you permanently defending yourself. Healthy conflict may become broader for a while, but it eventually creates a more coherent understanding of what the disagreement is actually about. Goalpost moving creates the opposite experience. The longer you talk, the less certain you become about what you are even supposed to be answering. The trap is especially effective if you strongly need to be seen as reasonable. You think that one more explanation will finally clear things up, so you stay in the conversation long after it has stopped producing understanding. You correct one distortion, then another. You search through old messages. You reconstruct timelines. You explain your intentions in increasingly precise language. When the other person shifts again, you follow because leaving the argument feels like allowing the latest accusation to stand uncontested. After an hour, you may be defending your character against claims that had almost nothing to do with the original disagreement, and because you are emotionally exhausted, your ability to think clearly has deteriorated. At that point, you may apologize simply to end the conversation, accept responsibility you do not understand, or agree to something you did not originally believe was fair. This is why recognizing the structure of the argument matters more than winning each individual claim. If every answer generates a new standard, stop asking only whether you can answer the next accusation and start asking whether answers are actually moving the conversation anywhere. You might calmly return to the original issue and say that you are willing to discuss that issue, but you do not want to keep introducing unrelated complaints. If a second concern is genuinely important, it can be discussed separately. This may sound procedural, but it protects something psychologically important. It prevents the conversation from becoming an unlimited trial in which every mistake you have ever made can be introduced until you are too overwhelmed to maintain your position. You can also ask for specificity when accusations become broad. If someone says, "You always do this," ask what particular behavior they mean. If they say you never care, ask what happened in this situation that made them feel uncared for. Specificity gives both people something concrete to examine. Manipulative arguments often thrive in abstraction because statements like, "You're selfish," "You never listen," or "You always make everything about yourself," are difficult to resolve. You can produce 10 examples that contradict them and still be told those examples do not count. But when the conversation stays close to a specific action, there is a better chance of determining what happened, what responsibility exists, and what might reasonably change. There is a Stoic discipline in refusing to chase every accusation because not every claim deserves unlimited engagement. The Stoics placed enormous importance on directing attention deliberately rather than allowing external events to command the mind automatically. An accusation can create an immediate urge to defend yourself, especially when it is unfair. But the existence of an accusation does not create an obligation to spend the next 2 hours disproving it. You can consider whether there is truth in what was said, respond where a response is useful, and still decide that continuing the argument is no longer serving clarity. This is not the same as walking away whenever someone says something uncomfortable. Sometimes the most valuable conversations are uncomfortable. The question is whether discomfort is producing understanding or simply keeping you engaged in an endless defense. One sign that the argument has stopped being productive is repetition without integration. You have answered the same question several times, but each answer is treated as though it was never given. Another sign is contradiction in the standard itself. You are criticized for explaining too much, and then criticized for not explaining enough. You are told to give someone space, and later accused of not chasing them. You are expected to be honest, but punished whenever the honest answer is not the desired one. When the acceptable response can only be identified after you have failed to provide it, there may be no stable standard for you to meet. Recognizing that can save enormous amounts of emotional energy because you stop treating an impossible task as a communication problem you simply have not worked hard enough to solve. The behavioral change is not to become better at arguing. In many cases, it is to become willing to end an argument without achieving the emotional satisfaction of being fully understood. You can say that you have explained your position and do not have anything useful to add right now. You can suggest returning to the conversation later when both people are calmer. You can decline to answer a new accusation until the original issue is resolved. Most importantly, you can tolerate the possibility that the other person will interpret your decision to stop as evidence that they were right. That is often the hardest part. If you need them to agree that ending the conversation is reasonable, you are still dependent on the same approval that kept you trapped in it. Of course, this principle requires self-examination because we can move goalposts too. When someone answers a concern we raised, we may discover that we do not want to let go of the emotional position we occupied. We introduce another complaint because the first one no longer justifies our anger. We say we want an apology, receive one, and then decide the apology does not count because it did not arrive exactly as imagined. If we want clarity from others, we should be willing to notice when we are doing the same thing. A fair disagreement requires both people to allow resolved points to remain resolved and to name new issues honestly rather than pretending they were always the original issue. When you stop chasing moving goalposts, arguments often become shorter, but something more important changes internally. You stop assuming that every accusation contains a puzzle you must solve before you are allowed to leave. You become more comfortable saying that you understand what the other person thinks and still disagree. You can acknowledge a valid criticism without allowing it to expand into a verdict on your entire character. You can apologize for one action without accepting unrelated accusations, simply because they were introduced during the same emotional moment. This makes manipulation more difficult because confusion no longer guarantees prolonged access to your attention. And that shift matters because boundaries are not protected simply by stating them once. Other people learn what your boundaries mean by what happens after they cross them. If every violation produces another explanation but nothing changes in practice, the boundary may gradually become little more than a preference. To make it real, there has to be a predictable relationship between the limit you communicate and the action you take when that limit is ignored. That is where the next step becomes important. learning to make your boundaries expensive to violate without turning them into threats, punishment, or attempts to control someone else. A boundary becomes meaningful only when crossing it changes something. This does not mean every violation deserves punishment, confrontation, or the end of a relationship. It means that if someone can repeatedly ignore a limit and still receive exactly the same access to your time, attention, trust, energy, and presence, they gradually learn that the boundary exists mainly in language. You may say that you will not continue conversations where you are being insulted, but if every insult leads to another hour of explaining yourself, the practical lesson is that insults extend the conversation rather than end it. You may tell someone that you will not lend them money again until previous debts are repaid, but if enough guilt eventually produces another loan, they learn that the boundary is negotiable under pressure. You may say that privacy matters to you, but if someone repeatedly shares things you told them in confidence and you continue disclosing at the same depth, nothing in the structure of the relationship has changed. This is why a boundary cannot depend entirely on another person agreeing that it is reasonable. It becomes real through what you do when the limit is crossed. The phrase, "make your boundaries expensive to violate," can sound harsher than it needs to be, because the expense should not be revenge. You are not trying to make another person suffer so they learn a lesson. You are changing your own participation in response to information. If someone repeatedly interrupts you with insults during an argument, the consequence may simply be that the conversation ends when insults begin. If someone cannot keep sensitive information private, the consequence is that they receive less sensitive information. If a person repeatedly arrives very late without communicating, perhaps you stop arranging plans that require you to wait indefinitely. If someone consistently turns financial help into entitlement, you stop providing financial help. In each case, the consequence is connected to the behavior itself. You are not inventing pain to control them. You are removing the access that made the violation possible. This distinction matters because boundaries are often confused with demands. "You are not allowed to speak to me that way" may express a legitimate expectation, but you cannot actually control whether another adult chooses to speak that way. What you can control is whether you remain in the conversation when they do. "You must stop lying to me" describes what you want from the relationship, but you cannot make honesty happen through force of will. What you can decide is how much trust, access, or closeness remains possible when dishonesty continues. A boundary becomes stronger when it moves away from trying to govern another person's behavior and toward clarifying your own response to that behavior. This is a deeply Stoic distinction because it returns attention to the part of the situation where your agency actually exists. Many boundaries fail because we state them at the moment of maximum frustration but have not decided what we are willing to do afterward. We say, "If this happens again, I'm done," because we want the other person to understand how serious we are. But when it happens again, we discover that we do not actually want to leave. Then we make another threat, perhaps stronger than the first. Over time, both people learn that the language of consequence is emotional rather than operational. This is why consequences should be chosen carefully and realistically. Do not threaten what you are unwilling to carry out. A smaller consequence that you can consistently maintain is more meaningful than a dramatic ultimatum that collapses the moment it becomes uncomfortable. Imagine a colleague regularly contacts you late at night about matters that can wait until morning. You have asked them several times to stop, but you continue answering because ignoring the message makes you anxious. From their perspective, your words say that evenings are unavailable, while your behavior says that evenings remain available if the message is sent. You do not need an angry confrontation to change the pattern. You can simply stop responding until the time you said you are available. The first few times may feel uncomfortable because you are changing not only their expectation but your own habit of immediate responsiveness. Eventually, however, the boundary becomes visible through repetition. People often understand consistent behavior more clearly than repeated explanation. The same principle applies in emotionally difficult relationships, although the stakes can be higher. Suppose someone repeatedly raises their voice, insults you, and then apologizes afterward. You have explained many times that you will not participate in conversations that become abusive, but each time the behavior begins, you stay and try to calm them. Perhaps you remain because leaving feels rude, because you want to resolve the issue, or because they accuse you of avoiding the conversation whenever you attempt to step away. The behavioral shift is not to make them promise again that they will stop. It is to make your response predictable. When the conversation crosses the limit, you disengage and return only when respectful communication is possible. The first purpose of that consequence is not to change them. It is to stop exposing yourself to the behavior you already decided you would not participate in. This is where boundaries become emotionally difficult, because consequences often cost the person enforcing them too. If reducing access were painless, boundaries would be easy. You may lose closeness, convenience, financial cooperation, social approval, or a relationship you genuinely value. You may have to tolerate someone saying that you are overreacting or becoming difficult. Sometimes you will question yourself because the old arrangement, although unhealthy, was familiar. Manipulation often survives precisely because enforcing the boundary is more immediately uncomfortable than surrendering it. Giving in produces relief now, while maintaining the limit may create tension that lasts for days. If you evaluate your decision only by which option produces the fastest emotional comfort, the old pattern will usually win. There is also a temptation to explain the consequence repeatedly, so the other person understands that you are not being cruel. Sometimes explanation is appropriate, especially in close relationships where sudden changes in behavior would otherwise be confusing. But after the boundary has been communicated clearly, endless explanation can turn enforcement back into negotiation. You say you are leaving the conversation because insults have started, and the person demands that you stay and prove exactly which words were insulting. Now you are once again inside the interaction you intended to leave. At some point, clarity has to be followed by action. You can discuss the issue later if there is something worth discussing, but the immediate boundary does not require unanimous agreement before it can be enacted. A healthy consequence should also be proportional. If a friend arrives 15 minutes late once, ending the friendship would not demonstrate strong boundaries. It would suggest rigidity. If someone makes one insensitive comment and sincerely repairs it, permanently withdrawing trust may be unnecessary. Patterns, severity, context, and willingness to repair all matter. The purpose is not to become difficult to offend because everyone is afraid of losing you. The purpose is to create enough consistency that people understand your limits are connected to real choices rather than temporary emotional statements. Strong boundaries should make relationships clearer, not turn them into environments where everyone walks carefully around unpredictable punishment. It is equally important to recognize when a consequence has become an attempt to manipulate the other person. If you withdraw affection specifically to make them anxious enough to obey you, you are not enforcing a boundary. You are using the same mechanism we discussed with the silent treatment. If you threaten to leave every time you do not get your way, the language of boundaries has become a tool of control. The difference lies partly in purpose and partly in structure. A boundary says, in effect, I cannot continue participating under these conditions, so this is what I will do. Manipulation says, I will make these conditions painful enough that you will do what I want. The distinction can be subtle, which is why honest self-examination matters. Over time, consistent boundaries remove a great deal of unnecessary argument. You no longer need to convince someone for the 10th time that a behavior bothers you. They may still disagree with your standard, but they understand what your participation looks like when that behavior occurs. This gives the other person genuine choice as well. They can decide whether the relationship under those conditions works for them. Sometimes they adjust because they value the relationship. Sometimes they do not, and you discover that the connection depended on access you are no longer willing to provide. Neither outcome requires you to force them to become different. There is a quieter psychological change happening underneath all of this. Every time you communicate a reasonable limit and then behave consistently with it, you provide yourself with evidence that your own words matter. You stop making promises to yourself that disappear under pressure. This builds a form of self-trust that cannot be created through affirmations because it comes from observing your own behavior. You know that if someone crosses a particular line, you will not need to invent courage in the moment. You have already decided how you participate. That predictability makes manipulation harder because pressure has less room to rewrite your position each time. But even strong boundaries can become difficult to maintain if you cannot tolerate what other people may think about them. Someone may call you selfish when you reduce access, cold when you stop over-explaining, arrogant when you refuse to defend yourself, or uncaring when you allow them to experience disappointment. If every misunderstanding sends you back into explanation and self-doubt, another person can still influence you simply by assigning an identity you desperately want to reject. The next layer, then, is learning to remain open to genuine criticism while becoming comfortable with the fact that sometimes you will be misunderstood. Being misunderstood is difficult for a reason that goes deeper than simple disagreement. When someone misunderstands an event, you can often correct the facts and move on. But when someone misunderstands you, the experience touches identity. They may think you are selfish when you were trying to protect a reasonable limit, cold when you were trying not to react emotionally, dishonest when you were simply unwilling to disclose something private, or arrogant when you stopped defending yourself against an accusation you had already answered. The natural impulse is to correct the picture. You explain what you meant, provide context, clarify your intentions, and perhaps tell the story again from another angle because you believe that if the other person could only see what was actually happening inside you, the tension would disappear. Sometimes that is exactly what good communication requires. Relationships would become shallow if we never tried to correct misunderstandings. But there is a point where the desire to be understood becomes a need to control how another person sees you. And once your peace depends on changing their interpretation, misunderstanding becomes another form of leverage. This is especially powerful when the accusation touches an identity you care deeply about. If you need to see yourself as generous, being called selfish can pull you into a long defense. If loyalty matters to you, someone suggesting that you abandoned them may make you question a boundary you had good reasons to establish. If you value fairness, being accused of manipulation or cruelty can feel almost intolerable because the accusation conflicts with the person you believe yourself to be. The temptation is to prove your character through the immediate situation, but that is where you can become controllable. Someone does not necessarily need to prove that your decision is wrong if they can attach an identity to it that you are desperate to reject. You say no, and the conversation becomes about whether you are selfish. You ask for distance, and now you must prove that you still care. You stop participating in an unhealthy argument, and suddenly leaving becomes evidence that you cannot handle accountability. If every label forces you back into the conversation, the label has become a reliable way to regain access to you. Part of becoming harder to manipulate is accepting that another person's interpretation of you may remain incomplete even after you communicate well. You can explain your position clearly, listen to what they heard, correct something they genuinely misunderstood, and still reach a point where they see you differently. This does not mean you should become indifferent to feedback. In fact, the ability to tolerate misunderstanding can make you better at receiving criticism because you no longer have to choose between total agreement and total rejection. If someone says you were selfish, you can examine the specific behavior without accepting the entire identity. Perhaps there is something you overlooked. Perhaps your boundary was legitimate, but your delivery was unnecessarily harsh. Perhaps you were thinking only about yourself in that moment and need to repair something. Or perhaps, after honest examination, you still believe the decision was fair. You can take the criticism seriously without handing the other person final authority over what the criticism means. This is a subtle but important distinction because "I don't care what anyone thinks" is not emotional strength. Sometimes it is defensiveness. We need other people partly because they can see aspects of us that we cannot see alone, and a person who dismisses every uncomfortable interpretation risks becoming insulated from reality. The stronger position is more demanding. Care enough to listen, but not so desperately that every opinion becomes a verdict. You allow another person's perspective into your thinking, compare it with your behavior and values, make corrections when they are warranted, and then accept that you may still reach a different conclusion. The goal is not to become immune to influence. It is to become more selective about what kind of influence deserves authority. The Stoics understood reputation in a similar way. They did not argue that reputation was meaningless in practical life. Being trusted, respected, and understood can matter enormously in families, communities, and work. Their deeper point was that reputation is partly external because it exists inside other minds. You can influence it through conduct, but you cannot possess it completely. Marcus Aurelius could govern whether he acted justly, but he could not govern every story told about his actions. That distinction becomes psychologically useful in ordinary relationships. You can govern whether you were honest. You can examine whether you behaved fairly. You can correct factual misunderstandings. But you cannot guarantee that another person will interpret your boundary as healthy, your silence as restraint, or your departure as necessary. At some point, trying to control that interpretation begins costing more than the misunderstanding itself. Consider what happens when someone has an emotional reason to misunderstand you. If accepting your explanation would require them to acknowledge that your boundary is legitimate, they may prefer the interpretation that you have become selfish. If recognizing your distance as a response to repeated disrespect would require them to examine their behavior, it may be easier to say that you suddenly became cold. This does not mean every criticism is avoidance or that anyone who misunderstands you is acting in bad faith. It simply means that explanations do not enter a neutral mind. People interpret us through their own needs, histories, fears, and interests, just as we interpret them through ours. Sometimes the most accurate explanation you can give will still not produce the interpretation you want. This is where behavior becomes more important than repeated self-defense. If someone believes you are selfish because you stopped being endlessly available, you do not necessarily need to convince them through argument. Continue behaving according to the standard you believe is fair. Be generous where generosity is freely chosen. Keep commitments you actually make. Treat people with consideration. Say no where no is necessary. Over time, your behavior provides a more reliable account of your character than the defensive speech you could give in one emotional conversation. And if someone remains committed to a negative interpretation despite consistent evidence, you may eventually have to accept that the interpretation belongs to them. Practicing this in smaller situations helps because the need to correct perception often appears everywhere. You send a brief message and worry that it sounded rude, so you send another message explaining the first. You decline an invitation and immediately add several reasons because you do not want anyone to think you are antisocial. You disagree in a meeting and then spend the next hour wondering whether everyone now thinks you are difficult. These moments may seem unrelated to manipulation, but they reveal how dependent your internal state is on imagined interpretations. The more you can allow small misunderstandings to exist without compulsively correcting them, the less vulnerable you become when someone deliberately or unintentionally uses a negative interpretation to pressure you. There is also a strange relief in realizing that being understood perfectly was never a realistic goal. Even people who love you deeply will sometimes interpret you incorrectly. You will do the same to them. Language is imperfect, memory is imperfect, and each person sees the relationship from inside a different nervous system and personal history. Healthy relationships are not relationships without misunderstanding. They are relationships where misunderstanding can be explored without either person having to surrender their entire perspective. When that is not possible, endless explanation rarely fixes the deeper problem. As this becomes more familiar, you begin asking a different question when someone assigns a painful identity to your decision. Instead of immediately asking how to convince them that you are not selfish, cold, difficult, or disloyal, you ask whether there is useful truth in what they are saying. If there is, you work with it. If there is not, you allow the discomfort of being seen inaccurately to pass without rearranging your life to correct the image. That is a much quieter form of emotional independence than declaring that opinions do not matter. Opinions matter, but they no longer govern automatically. And this prepares you for the most difficult boundary of all, because sometimes the only way to keep a person in your life is to continue giving them access that harms you. You may understand every manipulation, recognize every pattern, communicate clearly, and establish boundaries, yet still discover that the relationship survives only when you betray those boundaries. At that point, the question changes. It is no longer whether you can make the other person understand or behave differently. It becomes whether you are willing to lose a relationship that can only be preserved by repeatedly losing yourself inside it. There is a point at which understanding manipulation is no longer enough. You can recognize guilt, emotional pressure, shifting arguments, punishment through silence, and the repeated crossing of boundaries. You can become better at slowing down, explaining less, trusting patterns, and refusing to make decisions simply because someone is upset. All of that can make you much harder to control. But there is still one vulnerability that can override everything you have learned: the belief that this particular person must remain in your life at almost any cost. As long as losing someone feels more frightening than repeatedly abandoning your own judgment, there is always a price you may eventually be willing to pay to keep them. The price may be your time, privacy, dignity, values, emotional stability, or the right to make ordinary decisions without fear of punishment. You may know exactly what is happening and still participate in it because knowledge does not remove attachment. Sometimes the final source of another person's leverage is simply that they know you are more afraid of losing them than you are of losing yourself inside the relationship. This does not mean that emotional strength requires becoming willing to walk away from everyone easily. People matter, and losing an important relationship can be deeply painful. There are relationships worth fighting for, misunderstandings worth working through, habits worth forgiving while someone genuinely tries to change, and difficult periods where loyalty requires patience rather than immediate withdrawal. A philosophy that treats every uncomfortable relationship as disposable would not produce strength. It would often produce isolation and avoidance. The question is not whether a relationship ever asks you to compromise. Every meaningful relationship does. The more useful question is what kind of compromise keeps being required. There is a difference between adjusting your preferences because another person matters and repeatedly violating your own values so that they will remain. There is a difference between sacrificing comfort and sacrificing self-respect, just as there is a difference between meeting someone halfway and continually moving your half of the distance until there is almost nothing left of your original position. The pattern can be difficult to see because self-betrayal rarely begins dramatically. You do not usually wake up one morning and consciously decide that another person's approval matters more than your own judgment. It happens through small adjustments that each seem manageable. You avoid one subject because it always creates an argument. You stop spending time with someone they dislike because dealing with their jealousy is exhausting. You share a password you did not want to share because refusing made you look suspicious. You apologize for something you do not believe was wrong because the silence has lasted too long. You tolerate a comment that crossed a line because confronting it would ruin the evening. None of these moments alone may seem large enough to define the relationship, but repeated often enough, they begin reorganizing your behavior around one central objective, preventing the other person from reacting badly. Eventually, you may notice that you are making decisions with an invisible audience in your mind. Before accepting an invitation, you think about how they will react. Before expressing an opinion, you edit it into something safer. Before setting a boundary, you calculate the argument that will follow. You may still technically have freedom, but you are using that freedom primarily to avoid consequences inside the relationship. This is one reason controlling dynamics can persist without explicit commands. The other person does not have to tell you what to do every time if you have already learned which choices create punishment and which choices preserve peace. Your behavior begins adapting in advance. At that stage, the fear of loss deserves careful examination because it can make almost any behavior negotiable. If someone knows, consciously or unconsciously, that the possibility of losing the relationship terrifies you, withdrawal becomes powerful. Threats of leaving become powerful. Statements like, "Maybe we just shouldn't be together," "Perhaps I don't need people like you in my life," or "If you really believed that, I don't know how we can continue," can end discussions that would otherwise require them to engage with your position. Sometimes those statements are legitimate expressions of incompatibility. A person is allowed to decide that a boundary or value genuinely makes the relationship impossible for them. The manipulation appears when the possibility of ending the relationship is repeatedly introduced, not as an honest conclusion, but as pressure designed to make you abandon whatever position created the conflict. The strongest response is not to threaten them back. It is not to say, "Fine, leave," simply to prove that you are stronger. That can become another performance driven by fear. The deeper shift is internal. You begin accepting that there are conditions under which keeping a relationship would cost more than losing it. This does not make the loss painless. It makes the pain meaningful rather than controlling. You may desperately want someone to stay and still know that you cannot purchase their presence with unlimited access to your boundaries. You may love them and still recognize that love cannot require you to become increasingly dishonest with yourself. This is where Stoic philosophy reaches one of its most demanding conclusions. The Stoics repeatedly warned against treating external things as though our moral survival depended on possessing them. Relationships were not meaningless to them, but another person could not be allowed to become the owner of your character. Epictetus was particularly uncompromising about the idea that what belongs to your judgment and choice cannot safely be surrendered merely to preserve something external. Applied to modern relationships, that does not mean treating people as replaceable. It means remembering that no relationship can be healthy if its continuation requires you to repeatedly act against the person you believe you should be. There is an important complication here because sometimes we use the language of not betraying myself to avoid growth. Someone asks us to become more accountable, considerate, reliable, or emotionally available, and we respond that they are asking us to change who we are. But not every uncomfortable adjustment is self-betrayal. Sometimes the person you are trying to preserve is simply a version of yourself that does not want to be challenged. This is why values matter more than preferences. If your partner asks you to communicate instead of disappearing during conflict, that may require discomfort without violating your integrity. If a friend asks you to stop making jokes that repeatedly hurt them, changing that behavior is not necessarily losing yourself. The question is whether the relationship is asking you to become more honest and responsible, or asking you to become smaller, less autonomous, and less able to trust your own judgment. One way to see the difference is to look at who you are becoming in order to maintain the connection. Are you becoming more truthful, patient, reliable, and capable of listening, even when the process is uncomfortable? Or are you becoming increasingly anxious, secretive, apologetic, dependent, and uncertain of your own perception? Do you feel able to bring more of reality into the relationship, or are there more and more things you cannot safely say? Are compromises moving in both directions, or are you repeatedly the person who adjusts because the consequences of not adjusting are too exhausting? These questions do not provide instant answers, but over time they reveal whether adaptation is producing maturity or erosion. If you reach the point where a relationship genuinely depends on repeated self-betrayal, the practical change may still happen gradually. Perhaps you stop giving in to one form of pressure and observe what happens. You enforce a boundary consistently. You stop chasing after withdrawal. You refuse to defend yourself for hours. You allow the other person to decide what they will do with this new reality. Sometimes the relationship changes because the old pattern no longer works and both people begin relating differently. Sometimes the other person becomes more aggressive because they experience your autonomy as a loss of control. And sometimes the relationship ends, not because you wanted it to end, but because the version that could survive required a level of compliance you were no longer willing to provide. That possibility is painful enough that it should not be romanticized. Walking away does not automatically feel empowering. You may miss the person. You may question yourself repeatedly. You may remember their best qualities and wonder whether you exaggerated the worst ones. There may be evenings when the old arrangement seems easier simply because it was familiar. Emotional freedom does not mean becoming untouched by attachment. It means that attachment no longer has unlimited authority over what you will accept. And this is ultimately what makes a person difficult to manipulate. It is not learning clever responses or becoming suspicious enough to detect every tactic. It is not becoming emotionally unreachable. You become difficult to manipulate when there is no single emotional button that reliably overrides your judgment. Guilt can make you reflect without automatically making you comply. Anger can make you listen without automatically making you surrender. Silence can hurt without automatically making you chase. Misunderstanding can bother you without forcing you to explain yourself indefinitely. And the possibility of losing someone can frighten you without making every condition for keeping them acceptable. The goal was never to become impossible to influence. The people we love should influence us. Good arguments should change our minds. Honest criticism should make us examine ourselves. Relationships should ask something of us, and sometimes what they ask will be difficult. The difference is that influence leaves room for judgment, while manipulation tries to bypass it. Once you learn to protect that space inside yourself, you can remain open without becoming easily controlled, compassionate without becoming responsible for everyone's emotions, and deeply connected without making connection dependent on abandoning your own mind. Perhaps that is the quieter form of freedom the Stoics were pointing toward. Not a life in which nobody can hurt you, disappoint you, leave you, or misunderstand you, but a life in which none of those possibilities automatically determines who you become or what you choose. Other people remain important, sometimes painfully important, but your character is no longer the price you are willing to pay for their presence. There is no technique that can make you completely immune to manipulation if you are still trying to avoid every uncomfortable emotion that relationships can create. Guilt will still appear. Someone's anger may still shake you. Silence may still make you anxious. Being misunderstood may still hurt. The possibility of losing someone may still frighten you enough that part of you wants to compromise simply to make the fear stop. None of that means you have failed. It means you are human, and manipulation works precisely because it attaches itself to needs that are already real. The need for belonging, approval, safety, clarity, and connection. The change happens when those needs stop making decisions on your behalf. You notice the guilt and examine it. You notice the pressure and create time. You hear the accusation without immediately defending your entire identity. You allow someone to be disappointed without assuming that disappointment is yours to erase. You stop chasing silence, stop arguing with moving goalposts, and stop giving deeper access to people who repeatedly use that access against you. None of these responses requires becoming cold. In fact, they can make your relationships more honest because your yes begins to mean yes again, your no becomes clearer, and your care is no longer mixed with fear of what will happen if you stop giving. This is where Stoicism becomes less about controlling other people and more about protecting the quality of your own judgment. The Stoics understood that we cannot govern another person's reaction, interpretation, or behavior, but we can become more deliberate about what we allow those things to produce inside us. That does not make us independent of everyone. It makes us less dependent on emotional pressure as a guide for what is right. And perhaps that is the real difference between influence and manipulation. Healthy influence gives you more information and leaves you with your judgment. Manipulation tries to make judgment too uncomfortable to use. It relies on urgency, guilt, confusion, withdrawal, fear, or the threat of losing something important enough that you stop asking what you actually believe. So the goal is not to become impossible to affect. The goal is to become harder to steer without your consent. You can listen deeply, love deeply, compromise, apologize, reconsider, and still remain connected to your own mind. You can let people matter without letting their reactions become the final authority over your choices. And when you reach that point, manipulation loses much of its power because there is no easy route around your judgment anymore. Pressure can still reach you, but it no longer gets to decide for you.